Universal, particular and individual. Section 1. The subject is neither an individual nor a group but a relation. The category of subjectivity makes its appearance here as a logical category, specifically, the first division of the notion. Subjectivity is a relation and a relation which entails the consciousness of human beings. The subject is the living being which is aware of that subjectivity. That could be a person, aware of their own subjectivity, or it could be a group of people, who share a conception and constitute it together. But rather than group, we should say a relation amongst people, since there should be no implication in the notion of subjectivity that people see themselves as a group or are, through the relevant subjectivity, seen by others as a group. The word subject connotes an entity rather than a relation or activity. So we should reserve the word subject for when that subjectivity is referred to itself and constitutes itself as a self-conscious entity. The word subjectivity, which is the word used by Hegel here in the Logic, then has the broader meaning, in connection with a shape of consciousness, which goes to constitute the mind of one or many human beings, but does not necessarily have the meaning of one or a group of human beings. With these qualifications, the word subject can be used where perhaps it is more precise to use the word subjectivity, which is consistent with Hegel's usage, with subject carrying the connotation of a subjectivity being a personage of some kind, an active agent in the development of a shape of consciousness. This understanding of the notion of subject arises the structuralist understanding, in which a person can be the carrier of a shape of consciousness, without necessarily knowing themselves to be such a carrier. But to the extent that the subject has self-consciousness, and to some extent shares in absolute knowledge, that is to say, the philosophical insight that the universal is an historically formed shape of consciousness in which they are a participant, and their subjectivity has its subsistence in that universal, does the subject transcend this kind of unconscious agency? These are the distinctions which are dealt with in the phenomenology. This conception contrasts with Kant's usage in which a transcendental, individual subject uses their personal access to reason and 68. Hegel's logic. Experience to actively produce their own consciousness. Hegel's insight into the cultural and historical location of shapes of consciousness transcends this individualism. The abstract notion or subject is the first concept of the doctrine of the notion, which develops up to the idea, the concrete whole of a form of social life. This first abstract concept which constitutes the starting point for a science is of crucial significance for Hegel. Finding the correct starting point and then allowing the concept to unfold itself by the method of immanent critique, demonstrating what lies within that simple concept constitutes the method of science, and the logic forms the model for this method. In this case, the abstract notion or subject, which has arisen out of everything that has gone before, forms the starting point of the science of the idea. In that sense, just as the molecule is the unit of analysis for chemistry, and the single cell the unit of analysis for biology, the subject is the unit of analysis for the study of formations of consciousness, that is to say, the simplest thing which demonstrates all the properties of the whole, the basic thought object which constitutes the building block of social life. As we have seen, the development leading up to the emergence of the notion does not have the form of a transcendental subject which simply takes on attributes or a small concept which gets bigger and bigger. The abstract notion is itself the germ or prototype or phenomenon or embryo of a developed, concrete relation. What went before created the conditions of possibility of the notion, and asked the question, so to speak, but the positing of the notion is a sharp break, something new. Prior to the emergence of the notion we see every imaginable combination of other pre-existing notions and ultimately failed attempts to reflect what was emergent in being. Like the Judgment of Solomon, or a Declaration of Independence or the Magna Carta, the notion emerges out of the throng of disputation and lays the basis for further development. It might perhaps seem that, in order to state the notion of an object, the logical element were presupposed and that therefore this could not in turn have something else for its presupposition, nor be deduced. Just as in geometry logical propositions as applied to magnitude and employed in that science, are premised in the form of axioms, determinations of cognition that have not been and cannot be deduced. Now although it is true that the notion is to be regarded, not merely as a subjective presupposition but as the absolute foundation, yet it can be forward. 69. So only in so far as it has made itself the foundation. Abstract immediacy is no doubt a first, yet in so far as it is abstract it is, on the contrary mediated, and therefore if it is to be grasped in its truth its foundation must first be sought. Hence this foundation, though indeed an immediate, must have made itself immediate through the sublation of mediation. Science of Logic section 1279. A notion has from the very beginning three moments, individual, universal and particular. Think of when a new word, universal, is coined which becomes known to an individual person who now coordinates their particular activity with others having in mind the new word. The same kind of visualization works for the new judicial precedent, or programmatic declaration that initiates a social movement, a project of some kind, a new technical invention, and so on. In the beginning these breakthroughs are abstract in the sense that they are untested, their implications are yet to unfold and even those participating through their action in the new relation may not be fully committed to the new idea, which might disappear tomorrow. The new abstract notion takes its place amidst other competing notions, and only by merging with those other notions can an abstract, new notion concretize itself. Section 2. The subject is the truth of being in essence, Hegel says. Thus the notion is the truth of being in essence, inasmuch as the shining or show of self-reflection is itself at the same time independent imdiacy, and this being of a different actuality is immediately only a shining or show on itself. Shorter logic. Section 159. After the whole series of failed projects, chimeras, false dawns and disappointments which constitute the prehistory of a thing, the various efforts of an emergent form of social practice to understand itself and find a form in which its content can be fruitfully developed, eventually this selfsame material, the material of reflection, gives birth to something that does not pass away, something permanent, something which does not flee at the first sign of enemy fire or disintegrate in internal dissension, but actually absorbs fire and grows stronger from internal debate. But its material is gathered from reflection, so in that sense it is the truth of essence. The notion is the truth of being in a double sense, since essence is already the truth of being, but also, as the reflected form of being which 70. Hegel's logic does not pass away and proves to be persistent, it is in that sense the truth of being, it's what being turned out to be. The notion is both immediate and mediated. It is mediated because it is the outcome of a protracted process of reflection and is itself a form of reflection, but it is also given sensuously and immediately. This takes us back to the conception first formulated by Hegel in his early 1802–03 manuscripts, System of Ethical Life, of the idea as the unity of intuition and concept. The new notion is perceived in the same way as any other thing, sensuously. Given that we live, predominantly, in a second nature, made up of artifacts, everything in this world interconnects with other things, finds its use in relation to other things and through the cooperative activity of people using elements of the culture, all of them given to us immediately, in intuition or sensation. At the same time, as we have seen, the notion is a product of thought and exists only insofar as it is meaningful. The claim that the idea is the unity of intuition and concept is reproduced in the claim that the notion is the unity of being in essence. Subjectivity throws being into a new light. It is not that what was only sensuous perception becomes conceptual, being is always theory-laden. There is no such thing as pure being, that is, immediacy which is not also at the same time mediated. But subjectivity throws being into a new light. Being is the same but not the same. Likewise, the contradictory series of determinations in essence is made sense of from the standpoint of subjectivity, which has sublated all the contradictions that led up to its emergence. The doctrine of the notion is made up of subject, object and idea. The idea is the unity of subject and object, the process in which the objectification or institutionalization of the subject continues to drive the development of the active and living subject. This development of the subject itself, the inner development of the subject which continues within and alongside its objectification, has the form of the movement towards an all-round developed relation between individual, universal and particular. For the moment, we will just be concerned with the inner development of the subject, or notion. Later we will turn to the development of the subject-object relation. Forward. 71. Section 3. The concept is the identity of the individual, universal and particular. Hegel's exposition of the three moments of the notion and their relations is obscure in the extreme. Let us take a look first at the universal notion. The universal is that simplicity which, because it is the notion, no less possesses within itself the richest content. First, therefore, it is the simple relation to itself, it is only within itself. Secondly, however, this identity is within itself absolute mediation, but it is not something mediated. Science of Logic. Section 1327. The universal is given to us by a word or symbol or tool or body shape or whatever which represents the notion in free equality with itself in its specific character. Shorter Logic. Section 163. It is simple and imdiate because in it as such there is no relation, no activity entailed in it, without particularity and without individuality. But the entire content is implicit, in that as part of a language or other culturally constructed system of meanings or its potential connection with other universal forms in some particular system of activity, in which it shows itself to be meaningful, in fact, the very carrier of meaning. It is absolute mediation as on its own it is just a dead thing, like a word from the language of a long-lost civilization, and the mediation is entirely within itself. It is what it is independently of its use or presentation by any person, but as such it is a nothing. Take a word out of its language and the context of its use by people and it is nothing, but the meaning is still there, implicitly. It is like the unknown lock which can be opened by a key found on the road. As universal notion, it is eternal, it is that which is instantiated in every particular. The universal notion is not to be understood as a contingent attribute uniting an otherwise arbitrary set of objects, as in set theory, but as a self-subsistent genus. Hegel likened the first, abstract universal, particular and individual notions to the first moments of reflection. Universality, particularity and individuality are, taken in the abstract, the same as identity, difference and ground. But the universal is the self-identical, with the express qualification, that it simultaneously contains the particular and the individual. Again, the particular is the different or the specific character, but with the qualification that it is in itself universal and is as an individual. Similarly, the individual must be understood to be a subject or substratum, which involves the genus. 72. Hegel's logic. And species in itself and possesses a substantial existence. Shorter logic section 164, in the simplest formal terms, the universal is a unique genus or qual-ity. The particular is the specification of the genus with any number of qualifications up to the point of limiting the category to a single instance, and the individual is just one concrete instance. But Hegel does a great deal with this relationship. In the above, he points out that the universal contains the particular and individual, i.e., a concrete universal cannot have an existence separate from its instantiation in particular individuals. That in successive instantiations, while the universal is always just as it is, the particular is always different, and in fact it is the specific difference which makes it a particular. That the particular is always nothing other than individuals, not something side by side with individuals. The individual is individual in the sense of the ancient conception of a substratum to which indefinitely many predicates inhere, and the individual is ground, because it is the only substratum in which the universal can be manifested and developed. The category of ground is given in the maxim, everything has its sufficient ground. If we ask how the particular is a particular of a given universal, then the ground ultimately lies in the individual. As an intermediary between the formal syllogistic relation and the meaning of these relations in terms of formations of consciousness, it is useful to take the universal, particular and individual as designating a social movement or formal organization. As an example of a self-constituting universal, a social practice performed by individuals organized around an ideal. The principle is the universal. The particular is the different groups and activities expressing the principle in different times and places, and the individual is the individual people executing these activities, belonging to different social groups constituting the movement and thinking with the relevant universal conceptions. In these terms, the universal is the word or name or shape by which the movement is recognized and represented, the banner around which people rally. The particular is the different instantiations of the movement, the branches, groups, events and so forth only in and through which can a movement be said to exist, and the individual, a person participating in the movement through the various particular instantiations of it. In this realization of the idea, the movement is the notion, and as such it must have a name or some kind of representation or definition. Forward. 73. Universal. There must be particular groups adhering to this name or principle, and those particular groups must have individual members or adherents who know themselves to be adhering to a particular group instantiating the given universal. For example, an advocate of the principle of solidarity, a writer perhaps, who purely and simply expounds the idea of solidarity without seeing the need to actually set up groups, campaigns, unions and so forth, or make the effort to mobilize and win over individuals to the idea, can be said to take as their motto, the universal is absolute. On the other hand, the frenetic, full-time activist who sets up campaigns, self-help groups, parties and so on, without bothering about how each of these endeavors furthers the now long forgotten reason for it all, can be said to take as their maxim, the particular is absolute. And finally, the advocate of people power and public opinion, who has no confidence in ideology or parties and institutions, can be said to take as their rule, the individual is absolute. Every movement has these characters in their ranks and their role is almost obligatory. All of these claims have an element of truth. But if full load one-sidedly, obviously they lead nowhere, because they are all abstract, but they are the three essential modes of existence of an idea. The second section of subjectivity presents a series of judgments in which one of the moments is joined to the subject in a judgment which comes successively closer to a notion of it. The third section of subjectivity presents a series of syllogisms, in which a judgment is mediated by one of the moments, which express the subject more or less effectively, but get closer and closer to the notion. There are about 12 judgments and 10 syllogisms, and we will only touch here on the most prominent points in the development. The judgments reproduce at a higher level the categories of being and essence, and are the qualitative judgment, the judgment of reflection, the judgment of necessity and the judgment of notion. Each of the judgments expresses only partially what it is that brings something under the notion. Each judgment is a successively more concrete characterisation of the subject as it becomes clear. This process of judgments is the registering in self-consciousness of the process unfolding in the objective logic, and therefore recapitulates the categories of essence in the form of more and more adequate notions, but at this stage, still notions which are one-sided and deficient. 74. Hegel's logic. In the qualitative judgment, the subject is ascribed a single quality, the relevant social practice is said to be good or bad, or novel or whatever. Hegel presents a logical critique of any such judgment, hinging around the point that equating an individual with a particular is always faulty. In the judgment of reflection, the subject is given in connection with other things, so that it is not just seen as having some quality, but as having a place in a system of social practice, connected with other practices, of being useful for something, or whatever. In the judgment of necessity is the subject taken under its genus, rather than just as sharing with others a contingent property but belonging to some living whole. In the judgment of the notion, these three judgments are brought together. Hegel gives the following example. This, the immediate individuality, house, the genus, being so and so constituted, particularity, is good or bad. This is the apodeictic judgment. All things are a genus, i.e. have a meaning and purpose, in an individual actuality of a particular constitution. And they are finite, because the particular in them may and also may not conform to the universal. Shorter logic section 179. This most developed judgment has risen to a concreteness where individual, universal and particular are brought together in characterizing the thing. In the case of each of these judgments, which are after all just making one judgment in relation to some form of social practice, Hegel demonstrates the deficiency of the judgment, its limitations. This demonstrates the action of skeptical critique as an existing formation of consciousness which is not yet fully conscious of itself, tries to define itself. No, it's not this or that quality, or just this or that connection with other things, and it may be this kind of thing, but that doesn't exhaust what it is, and so on. All these deficient judgments are reflected in one-sided forms of practice, that are still guided by conceptions reflecting the fact that the specific character of the relevant social practice has not been fully grasped, or in taking up a social position which obstructs the development of the notion. For example, people acting in relation to the thing taking account of just one attribute, that the event was amateurish, for example, or in terms of its relation to other social practices, that it was unofficial, for example, but eventually the individual, particular and uni. Forward. 75. Versal aspects of the thing are brought together with a recognition of the thing, that this is a spontaneous protest by new adherents, for example. Section 4. Each moment mediates between the other two. The next level of development of the subject involves bringing all three moments, individual, universal and particular, into proper relation, and Hegel calls these three-way relation syllogisms. The form taken by these syllogisms is that of a judgment mediated by one of the three moments of the notion. As with the judgments, each of these syllogisms is deficient in some way and open to criticism. Only when all the different possible combinations are brought together and concentrated in a single syllogism which gives weight to every aspect of the relation between individual, particular and universal, may the conception capture the notion. Like the judgments, the syllogisms also reproduce the categories of essence, the qualitative, or immediate, syllogism, the syllogism of reflection and the syllogism of necessity. Each syllogism unites the universal, individual or particular notion, with a judgment. The first immediate syllogism is the determinate syllogism, IPU, in which the individual is brought under a universal by virtue of coming under a particular. This is the most straightforward and immediate of syllogisms. The deficiency arises from the fact that the individual's relation to the universal may be fortuitous, as the individual is only participating in the universal by virtue of one particular. For example, he's got such a nice way with people, he'd make a good politician. The second immediate syllogism is the qualitative syllogism, PIU, in which a particular is subsumed under the universal only because one of its individuals are under the universal. This is an obviously incomplete claim as other individuals are excluded from consideration. There are altogether 4 such qualitative syllogisms. I'd never let an Indian doctor operate on me, look at that Dr. Patel. Hegel says that the qualitative syllogisms deal with particularity abstractly, whereas the syllogism of reflection extends this abstractness to encompass all individuals. So we have the syllogism of allness, also IPU, that an individual which is under a particularity comes under the universal because all individuals under that particularity come under the universal. The deficit is that the major premise, that all such individuals comes on. 76. Hegel's logic. The universal depends on the conclusion, namely that the individual in question comes under the particular. You can't tell me you're a footballer. You're only 5 feet 6 inches and no footballer is that short. The second syllogism of reflection is the syllogism of induction, UIP, deduces the universal from the particular, because all the particular individuals come under the universal, the deficit of which is that the particular is never complete, and does not cover all possible individuals, for example. There's more and more crime nowadays. You hear about a murder almost every day on TV. The third syllogism of reflection is the syllogism of analogy, IUP, lifts an individual to the status of a universal and deduces from a particularity of one individual to another similar, but the similarity may not be such as to justify the analogy. For example, Vietnam has proved that a small country defending its territory can defeat the USA. It's only a matter of time in Iraq. In each syllogism of reflection, an effort was made to make a generalization based on incomplete information, leading to unsafe conclusions. The next and third category of syllogism are the syllogisms of necessity, in which this limitation is to be overcome. The first syllogism of necessity is the categorical syllogism, IUP, and here instead of an arbitrary character of an individual, which may or may not unite it with another individual, being taken up, the genus which concretely unites it with other individuals is the middle term. The deficit of this syllogism is that even though particularity of an individual is deduced from its genus, without having a notion of the genus the syllogism is still open to error. He's a professor of neuroscience, he must know what consciousness is. The second syllogism of necessity is the hypothetical syllogism, AI implies B, A is, therefore B is. But in this B has its existence in B and the conditions which made A necessary are not necessarily the same conditions which make B follow from A. The deficit in the syllogism is therefore that the necessity of B must be known in itself, not mediately through A. For example, the fuel gauge says we're half full, we can't have run out of petrol. Forward. 77. And so on. We can all recognize these one-sided lines of argument. In every case they fail because they have not yet grasped the relevant notion, but it is only in and through such deficient judgments, which prove in practice to be deficient, that the notion consolidates itself and becomes a fact, not the outcome of a line of argument, but an objective fact. Section 5. Hegel presents the subject as a critique of formal logic. We should remind ourselves at this point of the basic thesis of the phenomenology, that formations of consciousness have to re-examine their basic rationale whenever their way of life is called into question. So in this section, Hegel has looked at how a range of seemingly justified statements may fail the test of logical examination. All the syllogisms he examines are deficient, but nonetheless, we see a positive outcome, in the form of a developed notion. The same thing happens in the sphere of social practice. Every judgment mentioned earlier, including the syllogistic judgments, is a proposition which is meaningful only if it is expressed in practical active ity. So the formal logical critique mirrors a practical critique, manifested in incremental change to forms of activity as well as subjective consciousness. The concretization of the concept takes place through objectification and further development, which happens through the development of both subject and object together, and the sublation of relatively abstract notions by more and more concrete notions, that incorporate into themselves a wider and wider sphere of social life. This subject-object development, where a formation of consciousness develops through the embedding of a new concept into every aspect of life, is called the idea. It can be helpful in understanding this part of Hegel's logic to take a voluntary organization as the relevant social practice or concept, with the policies and principles written into the organization's constitution and rules and the leadership body responsible for carriage of these principles understood as the universal, the various occupational, geographical or whatever branches or sections of the organization taken as the particular, and the members, whether rank and file or officials, as individual. This is a valid concretization of the idea of a subject in the sense considered in the logic, suffering only from the deficit of being overly formal and mechanical. With this analogy, which is somewhat more than an analogy, the notions, judgments and syllogisms of the section on subjectivity render. 78. Hegel's logic. Themselves as typical of the forms of consciousness encountered within such formal organizations. Lenin's insistence in 1901 that to be a member of the party an individual had to participate in one of the party's branches or activities is rational in this light. One-sided claims like an organization is only as good as its members, forgetting the necessary mediating role of branch and national leadership, are seen to be partial truths. On the other hand, the idea that individual members might have a say in the appointment of district officials certainly deserved more consideration than it received at the time. Or the idea that an individual delegate should represent their own branch or electorate when participating in debates on national policy. A mature organization which has undergone the complete development of subjectivity which Hegel envisages here must fully develop the mediating role of branches and sections in the relation between the leadership and membership. National leaders must take a close interest in representing the views and interests of ordinary members in relation to the particular interests of branch officials, and local officials are diligent and well informed in conveying national policies and issues to the membership, and so on and so forth. Each of these demands for the development of a mature social formation can be expressed in the form of the criticism of a syllogism. Full development means that every imaginable form of mediation between individual, particular and universal is developed. As a result, the thinking of individuals participating in such a formation of consciousness, thinking formed and expressed through participation in relevant organizations and relations, may be mature and rounded and avoid one-sidedness, such as particularism, elitism, dogmatism, activism and so on. 8. Subject, object and idea. Section 1. The subject develops from abstract to concrete. The 3 books of the logic are laid out in a logical sequence, and they describe a process of development, but the realized process of development does not take the form of a temporal succession of these categories. The categories of being which come into being and pass away, continue to come and go indefinitely. The succession of oppositions which overtake one another in essence continue to generate polar opposite pairs of determinations. As these unfold, a new form of social practice develops self-consciousness, with a succession of new qualities, new nt. Forward. 79. Ties, new relations, both incidental and necessary, registered in thoughts and purposive activity and representations, and judged in people may draw from these experiences a more concrete understanding of the new social practice as it develops. So in terms of time, all these relations are happening at the same time, although there is a logical dependence of the later categories on the former. The development described in the doctrine of the notion is the development of a concept. In the first place, what is described is what is necessary in the development, as opposed to what is contingent or accidental or as the result of some caprice, so the logical process differs from the historical process in that respect. Secondly, the subject domain of the logic is shapes of consciousness, or more precisely, the components of shapes of consciousness, which are concepts. But a concept is to be understood, in the same way as a shape of consciousness, as a regular system of activity which is organized around some conception which may be understood by the participants as an entity of some kind, that is, it is reified. Self-consciousness here implies that people involved in that system of activity bring together the forms of activity, their individual understanding of what they are doing and the representation of the activity into a consistent stable relationship. The series of judgments and syllogisms represent the moves towards the formation of that stable and mature relationship, and it is that consistent, worked-out relationship which brings about a stable reification. Finally, in tracing the development of these relationships within a formation of consciousness, three different aspects are always involved. The relations and collaborative activity of people which is integrated into the formation of consciousness, the consciousness of the individual people involved in the representations, words, symbols, artifacts and so on, used in the collaboration. This means that the process is exhibited in subjective thoughts, insofar as they follow what is necessary, social movements, or projects, self-conscious systems of practice sharing a conception of what it is people are doing, and the representations are systems of cultural artifacts, and the logic is open to interpretation in each of these domains. 80. Hegel's logic. Section 2. Sublation. The relation between the earlier and the later relations in the logic is that of sublation, Aufbung. Hegel uses the term sublation throughout the logic, including the relation in which one determination passes into another in the sphere of being, the relation in which one opposition is overtaken by another in the sphere of essence, and the way in which, in the doctrine of the notion, successive determinations are taken up by the subject. Aufbung means taking something beyond its own limits and negating it, that is to say, by maintaining what was necessary in the former relation while terminating that which is no longer tenable. This expresses the basic organizing principle of the logic. It's like when something is done away with because it is outmoded, but its real meaning is carried on in a new form. The form of sublation which subjectivity undergoes is a process of objectification, on top of which there is a continuous reassertion of subject and object in new forms which have the effect of sublating the distinctions between different subjects into higher or more robust forms of internal relation. This is related to an aspect of Hegelian thought which can be confusing. Hegel talks about a process and its truth as more or less the same thing, so he will talk about something which obviously doesn't have the attributes which would be expected of the thing. To the non-Hegelian this seems to be flying in the face of plain facts. For Hegel, there is ultimately only one concept, the idea, which we can understand as the whole of the social life of a community, and the specific concepts relating to this or that special activity are ultimately just aspects or special moments of the totality. But first, let us follow the subject-object relation in terms of how Hegel outlines the structure of the object. Section 3. Objectification. Mechanism, chemism, teleology, means and ends. Subject-object is a relation. Subject and object are not different kinds of thing, but simply that the subject stands in relation to other subjects as to an object. So the subject-object relation is the relation between a system of social practice and others which are relatively foreign to it, lie. Forward. 81. Outside of it. But the normal situation is that means of mediation between subjects do exist in a community, and we are not dealing with a confrontation of the kind of the master-servant narrative, in which no means of mediation exists. Hegel looks at three grades of subject-object relation: mechanism, chemism and teleology. You can visualize these relations in terms of relations between projects, social movements and institutions, such as a town plan, feminism, legal system and science, or different ethnic communities within a multicultural society, and so on, as well as concepts like computer communication, therapy, childhood, or whatever, a relation between one project, the subject, which is new, or abstract, and others which are already institutionalized and constitute the existing social context. Firstly, mechanism. This is how Hegel describes mechanism. As objectivity is the totality of the notion withdrawn into its unity, and immediate is thereby posited that is in and for itself this totality. Insofar as it has the notion immanent in it, it contains the difference of the notion, but on account of the objective totality, the differentiated moments are complete and self-subsistent objects which consequently, even in their relation, stand to one another only as self-subsistent things and remain external to one another in every combination. This is what constitutes the character of mechanism, namely, that whatever relation obtains between the things combined, this relation is one extraneous to them that does not concern their nature at all, and even if it is accompanied by a semblance of unity it remains nothing more than composition, mixture, aggregation and the like. Spiritual mechanism also, like material, consists in this, that the things related in the spirit remain external to one another and to spirit itself. A mechanical style of thinking, a mechanical memory, habit, a mechanical way of acting, signify that the peculiar pervasion and presence of spirit is lacking in what spirit apprehends or does. Science of Logic Section 1543. This brings to mind a multicultural society in which the ethnic mosaic metaphor applies, that is, a collection of self-sufficient communities mutually indifferent to one another, which may interact, but in the way of external impact on one another, in which neither community modifies its own nature, just adjusts its activity to accommodate or resist the impact of another community, or sciences, each of which is pursuing its own research program, perhaps using the findings of another as instruments in their own work, but remaining separate branches of science, or a social movement that regards all other movements as irrelevant to themselves. 82. Hegel's logic. That turn up to protest against something and happen to find other social movements there as well, and may go so far as agreeing the date in place of the protest, but no further. Hegel follows the development of mechanism through the concept of mechanical objects to mechanical processes to systems of mechanical relations, particularly where one object creates a center around which others revolve. He likens mechanism to systems of government in which the components are united mechanically, and traces the development of relations between individuals, I, organizations, P, and the state, U, using the idea of syllogisms, an approach he uses again in the philosophy of right. The second section of objectivity is chemism, where the subject and object have a selective affinity to one another based in each's own nature. So here the subject and object are not wholly external to one another, but recognize a relation within themselves, like social movements that recognize that both are fighting a common enemy, and in making common cause strengthen that affinity and even merge. Again, Hegel follows the development from chemical object to chemical process, and uses the syllogisms developed earlier to trace the relation between individual, universal and particular through which these processes develop, gradually dealing with the one-sidedness of the subjective syllogisms. Hegel wants to derive the notions of the physics, chemistry and biology of his times logically and is preparing the basis for his philosophy of nature in this section, but its usefulness in this respect is questionable. There is a fine line between intelligibility and rationality which Hegel often transgresses. But he does sketch out a plausible, escalating series of categories through which a subject objectifies itself, and ideas drawn from the natural sciences serve nicely for this purpose. A subject is abstract at the beginning and finds the outer world foreign and indifferent to it, and in that sense is a concept in itself. Then through the discovery of affinities it develops relations with all the other subjects in the community, and there is a certain amount of the melting pot underway. Hegel did not have at his disposal a viable natural scientific theory to explain the appearance of teleology in the natural world of plants and animals, but the teleology was undeniably real. Kant had recognized this problem as well and concluded that it went beyond the valid limits of knowledge to deduce from the appearance of the teleological character of the organic world that there was a designer or final cause behind it or otherwise to explain it. Hegel's aim was to demonstrate that the emer. Forward. 83. Gens of teleological relations was logically necessary. But he was opposed to any theory of evolution, whether inheritance of acquired characteristics or survival of the fittest, to do this job. Hegel held that in nature there was no development in time, but this does not exclude relations of logical priority in nature. The more the teleological principle was linked with the concept of an extramundane intelligence and to that extent was favored by piety, the more it seemed to depart from the true investigation of nature, which aims at cognizing the properties of nature not as extraneous, but as immanent determinatenesses and accepts only such cognition as a valid comprehension. As end as the notion itself in its existence, it may seem strange that the cognition of objects from their notion appears rather as an unjustified trespass into a heterogeneous element, whereas mechanism, for which the determinateness of an object is a determinateness posited in it externally and by another object, is held to be a more immanent point of view than teleology. Science of Logic section 1595. Hegel concluded that the end emerges as the truth of mechanism and chemism, that a notion strives to objectify itself. End is the concrete universal, which possesses in its own self the moment of particularity and externality and is therefore active in the urge to repel itself from itself. The notion, as end, is of course an objective judgment in which one determination, the subject, namely the concrete notion, is self-determined, while the other is not merely a predicate but external objectivity. But the end relation is not for that reason a reflective judging that considers external objects only according to a unity, as though an intelligence had given this unity for the convenience of our cognitive faculty. On the contrary, it is the absolute truth that judges objectively and determines external objectivity absolutely. Thus the end relation is more than judgment, it is the syllogism of the self-subsistent free notion that unites itself with itself through objectivity. Science of Logic section 1599. So here the subject finds in the object, in other subjects, its own end, or as it is sometimes said, the subject finds its own essence outside of itself. Thus the development here is one in which the subject is to become in and for itself through the process of mutual transformation of object and subject, which is the basis for the idea. The process of teleology is the dialectic of means and ends. We have two maxims. On the one hand, the end justifies the means, and on the other, the movement is everything, the end nothing. Both these maxims are limited and one-sided. The subject strives to realize its end. 84. Hegel's logic. At first by inadequate means, and the realized end expresses the disharmony between the means and the subjective end. This leads to a reconception of the end and determination of a new means more adequate to the end. Finally, there can be no contradiction between the means and realized end. Ultimately the subject realizes that the means and end are identical. Section 4. Mediation and the cunning of reason. Hegel shows how it is the mediation of actions by means of the artefacts and the objectified practices of a community which ensures that whatever may be a subject's aims in some action, it is the development of spirit, the working out of the inner problems of a whole social formation, which is the outcome. This idea of reason manifesting itself in human actions, independently of the subjective intentions of those pursuing their own ends in the given action, Hegel calls the cunning of reason, and it appears both in the logic and his philosophy of history. For example, individuals may bring a dispute into the legal system, but it is decided with reference to the body of written law and the judgment of the courts having mind to the further development of the law, not just the resolution of the immediate issue in dispute. Likewise, when people use tools acting on some material to achieve their ends, they must perforce use these tools according to their affordances and therefore in line with the constraints of both nature and the historically developed forces of production. So the outcome which results discloses the possibilities inherent in nature and the social forces of production, which may or may not be what the subject had in mind in taking up the tools to realize their own ends. The realized end therefore is a merging of the intentions motivating the subject's actions and objective tendencies inherent in the culture. The subject here means not just an individual, but any project, human enterprise or formation of consciousness which arises within the fabric of a community. Thus the universal requirements of nature and history manifest themselves in the finite actions of individuals and social movements, thanks to the fact that no subject can achieve its ends in the natural or social world except by using the universal products of that wider world. As Hegel put it, reason is as cunning as it is powerful. Cunning may be said to lie in the intermediative action which, while it permits the objects to follow their own bent and act upon one another till they waste away, and forward. 85. Does not itself directly interfere in the process, is nevertheless only working out its own aims. Shorter Logic, section 209n. The subject and object are each mutually independent totalities, but the means, that is, the object, is superior in the long run. That the end relates itself immediately to an object and makes it a means, as also that through this means it determines another object, may be regarded as violence in so far as the end appears to be of quite another nature than the object, and the two objects similarly are mutu ally independent totalities. The means is superior to the finite ends of external purposiveness. The plough is more honorable than are immediately the enjoyments procured by it and which are ends. Science of Logic section 1614. So whilst a person can do as he or she chooses, as a natural and a cultural being our ends are, in the final analysis, found to be given to us. The tool lasts while the immediate enjoyments pass away and are forgotten. In his tools man possesses power over external nature, even though in respect of his ends he is, on the contrary, subject to it. Science of Logic section 1615. As Hegel says in the Philosophy of History, it is not the general idea that is implicated in opposition and combat, and that is exposed to danger. It remains in the background, untouched and uninjured. This may be called the cunning of reason, that it sets the passions to work for itself, while that which develops its existence through such impulsion pays the penalty and suffers loss. Philosophy of History section 36. Individual human beings and the formations of consciousness in which they act are thus, for Hegel, forms by means of which Geist unfolds itself. Marx appropriated this idea in Capital. Labor is, in the first place, a process in which both man and nature participate, and in which man of his own accord starts, regulates, and controls the material reactions between himself and nature. He opposes himself to nature as one of her own forces. An instrument of labor is a thing, or a complex of things, which the laborer interposes between himself and the subject of his labor, and which serves as the conductor of his activity. He makes use of the mechanical, physical, and chemical properties of some substances in order to make other substances subservient to his aims. Capital, Volume I, Chapter 6.1. 86. Hegel's Logic. Lev Vygotsky agreed. In the context of comparing mediation by tools and mediation by symbols, he says, with full justification, Hegel used the concept of mediation in its most general meaning, seeing in it the most characteristic property of mind. He said that mind is as resourceful as it is powerful. In general, resourcefulness consists in mediating activity that, while it lets objects act on each other according to their nature and exhaust themselves in that activity, does not at the same time intervene in the process, but fulfills only its proper role. Man acts on behavior through signs, that is, stimuli, letting them act according to their own psychological nature. LSVCW version 4. Page 61-2. Section 5. The idea is the unity of life and cognition. With this final section of the logic, we see the return of the original idea that Hegel presented in the System of Ethical Life. The idea is a process in which the contradiction between sensation and reason is overcome through a long drawn-out process of differentiation and reintegration, objectification and internalization, with a continual interchange between means and ends. So the idea is a dialectic of life and cognition. It is both a learning process and a life process. Truth is the correspondence of subject and object, but both subject and object have been conceived of as part of a single process of development. In the section on life, Hegel discusses the relationship of individual and genus. The genus can live only in and through the finite mortal individuals which realize it, and conversely the individual finds its truth in its genus. That is to say, the process of the genus, in which the single individuals sublate in one another their indifferent immediate existence and in this negative unity expire, has further for the other side of its product the realized genus, which has posited itself identical with the notion. In the genus process, the separated individualities of individual life perish. The negative identity in which the genus returns into itself, while it is on the one hand the process of generating individuality, is on the other hand the sublating of it, and is thus the genus coming together with itself, the universality of the idea in process of becoming for itself. Science of Logic section 1676. The category of life leads to the category of cognition. Life is the immediate idea, or the idea as its notion not yet realized in its own self. In its judgment, the idea is cognition in general. Science of Logic section 1677, in Forward. 87. The section on cognition, Hegel takes up the idea of the true and the idea of the good, and the unity of the true and the good, which is the absolute idea. In the section on the true, Hegel deals with the relation between analytical cognition and synthetic cognition, and definitions and the division of subject matter in a science. Hegel sees cognition as a syllogism in which the first two terms are analytical and synthetic cognition, but even this formulation shows itself to be defective. Similarly, the unity of analytic and synthetic cognition finds propositions and laws, and proves their necessity, but not as a necessity of the subject matter in and for itself, that is, not from the notion, but as a necessity of the cognition that works on given determinations, on the differences of the phenomenal aspect of the subject matter, and cognizes for itself the proposition as a unity and relationship, or cognizes the ground of phenomena from the phenomena themselves. Science of Logic section 1721. Likewise, Hegel requires that the definition of the concepts in a science and the division of the subject matter in a science be determined immanently from the notion of the science, not arbitrarily or subjectively introduced from without. The final concept of the logic is the absolute idea, which appears as the unity of the theoretical idea and the practical idea, that is, the identity of a practical form of life with its own self-understanding, a concrete identity arrived at through the long drawn-out process described. The chapter on the absolute idea, like the final chapter of the Phenomenology, and like the 12 Days of Christmas, is a recapitulation of the whole structure leading up to itself, emphasizing the idea of concreteness as sublation. And in a final unbelievable leap of hermetic magic, the truth of the idea is nature. The idea, namely, in positing itself as absolute unity of the pure notion and its reality and thus contracting itself into the immediacy of being, is the totality in this form, nature. Science of Logic section 1817. The logic began with being, and the logic is simply an interrogation of what it means. Hegel unfolds from the fact of being the logic which constrains all of human life, not human life itself, but the laws, if you like, which constrain it. That which we don't make ourselves, but exists independently of us, is called nature, or being, but now concrete being. 88. Hegel's Logic. Section 6. Hegel's critique of the individual-society dichotomy. So what we have seen is that Hegel presented a critique of all aspects of social life by an exposition of the logic of formations of consciousness, which does not take the individual person as its unit of analysis but rather a concept. A concept is understood, not as some extramundane entity but a practical relation among people mediated by thought objects, i.e., artifacts. If we understand that human beings live in an environment of thought objects constructed by their own purposive activity, and that thinking, insofar as it is correct, reflects the objective relations between these thought objects, then this would seem to be a viable approach to science, and the basis for a genuinely self-construing method of science. Looked at with the benefit of 200 years of hindsight, the philosophy has its problems, this is undeniable, but recent currents of philosophy, such as post-humanism, which pride themselves in having deconstructed the subject, invariably make the target of their critique a Kantian or Cartesian individual subject, overlooking Hegel's solution of this problem, often by dismissing Hegel on the basis of side issues without confronting his achievement in overcoming the aporias in Kant's notion of the subject or the Cartesian dichotomy. And Hegel built a philosophy which overcame the contradictions inherent in Kantian individualism without the sacrifice of an ethical theory, without the sacrifice of a concept of genuine individuality, whilst retaining a strong concept of freedom. In the Logic, Hegel resolves the individual-society dichotomy as a problem in social science by means of the individual-universal-particular relation. This is not the same issue as the problem of how a subject conceives of itself in relation to the whole community. That is a problem of the historical development of consciousness, which is dealt with in the Phenomenology. But the Logic does suggest a solution to this problem as well. We see that subjectivity is a multiplicity of processes and relations in which individuals collaborate with one another in particular forms of social practice organized around different universals. This approach is far more fruitful than setting up two poles, the individual and society, whatever that means, and then trying to draw some connection between them. By taking the concept, in the sense described already, as his unit of analysis, rather than the individual person, Hegel has produced a powerful and nuanced conception of the human being. Note how far also. Forward. 89. He has come from the initial investigations into the psychology of Peoples. This is something radically different. This approach allows us to see that the individual may have a whole variety of different conceptions of truth and their capacity to verify their own truth, reflected in the multitude of conceptions of the absolute outlined in the Logic. So the relation of the individual to society which is developed in the logic is, on the one hand, the relation between a person and the state, and the various mediating forms of association, developed in the philosophy of right, and on the other hand, the very dicentered, shifting view of subjectivity constructed through participation in a multiplicity of self-conscious projects, or systems of social practice. Section 7. Spirit, substance and subject. Hegel's philosophy is certainly very strange and difficult to grasp. But we need to remember that his ideas were developed in response to specific and difficult problems in philosophy which were demanding resolution at that time. The problems at issue were chiefly those that arose from Kant's attempts to rescue science from an impossible relativism. So we should not lightly condemn Hegel, but rather give him credit for having produced a science, although a science with some important difficulties. We should take him at his word when he says that spirit is the nature of human beings en masse. All human communities construct their social environment, both in the sense of physically constructing the artifacts which they use in the collaborating together, and in the sense that, in the social world at least, things are what they are only because they are so construed. The idea of spirit needs to be taken seriously. It may seem odd to say, as Hegel does, that everything is thought, but it is no more viable to say that everything is matter, and if you want to use a dichotomy of thought and matter instead, things get even worse. No one else has produced anything that can rival his logic, and he left no room for imitators. It should be taken seriously. 9. The subject and culture. Logic and ontology. Section 1. Hegel has overcome the mind-matter dichotomy with logic. One of the problems which Hegel deals with in the logic is the problem of the Cartesian dichotomy between the mental and the material, and the various dichotomies which Kant generated in his effort to overcome. 90. Hegel's logic. The Cartesian dichotomy, especially the dichotomy between appearance and thing in itself and the dichotomy between sensation and concept. These dichotomies suggested by Descartes and Kant have considerable support in our ordinary everyday intuitive conceptions of the world. In general, people do suffer from the Cartesian illusion of having access to thought objects which are in some sense mirror images of real objects, with a mental world which is something quite distinct from the material world it reflects. The intuitive power of this idea is undeniable. But carefully thought through, it just doesn't hold up. Likewise, the idea that we live in a world of appearances constructed by ourselves out of processes which are in principle inaccessible to thought and walled off from appearances, but which impart the regularity and necessity from which we fashion appearances. The idea that we apply reason, to which our minds have direct access, to the material of sense perception also seems a very reasonable solution to the problems presented by Descartes. But again, this conception does not stand up to criticism, and there is a widespread conviction that there is something fundamentally wrong with any dichotomy, that is to say, any conception which sorts the world into two kinds of thing with a sharp line between them with no mediation or common root. However implausible Hegel's ideas are in places, we need to keep in mind that he does overcome the limitations of these intuitively very appealing systems of thought. So far as it is possible to generalize in this matter, where Hegel comes across a dichotomy, he accepts that the dichotomy is real, refuses abstract declarations which either abolish the dichotomy or arbitrarily subsume it under a third, and studies the dialectical relation between the two concepts, and the form of mediation, a relation which is different in each case. Section 2. Dichotomy just in terms of numbers. How does Hegel respond to dichotomy? In a sense, he does replace dichotomy with oneness in that he begins each of his major works with a single concept, be that being or space or right, and unfolds out of that single concept all the distinctions which are implicit within it, through a process of differentiation or diremption. So each dichotomy comes into play already with its roots in an earlier unified conception, and rather than having to be stitched back together or brought into relation, that relation is already implicit in the original conception. Forward. 91. In another sense, he replaces dichotomy with trichotomy, and there is a lot to be gained by a comparison of Hegel's work with that of Charles Sanders Peirce, who was a strong advocate of trichotomy. But trichotomy is literally to cut in three, and that is not what Hegel does. He does not sort the world into three kinds of thing. The number three comes up quite a lot in Hegel, but it is the trichotomy contained in the three moments of the subject, individual, particular and universal, which are of significance here. Does this triplet, which is the basis for all those syllogisms, which Hegel uses to elaborate the relations between various groups of concepts, really constitute a trichotomy, or on the other hand, does it succeed in allowing the subject matter to develop its own distinctions whilst retaining the unity and integrity of the original subject matter? Let's consider some object, say the Cussonia tree at Melbourne University. Tree is a universal, but the specification of the variety and genus of the plant, its location in a university and the name of the university, all particularize the thought down to an individual tree, and even if the plant does not exist and is a figment of the imagination, you know the tree through all those particularities. The words Cussonia, tree, Melbourne, and university, which are inscribed on the page, belong to the English language, and as words are universals. They exist materially only as marks on paper, vibrations in the air, an unlimited variety of material forms, but are what they are independently of the particular material form or the individual existence or otherwise of this particular instantiation of them. Finally, the momentary thought which exists as you contemplate the words is an individual thought. All of these moments are valid categories of thought, and none of them depend on whether the tree exists. but the same categories encompass the tree itself. The careful breeding of this variety in Zimbabwe, its transportation to Melbourne and its planting and maintenance by the university, constitute the practical activities which produce that tree, as part of the culture and history which produced that tree in that place and no other. The particularity mentioned above as moments of a thought object pure and simple, arises from the practical activity which constitute that particularity. It is always activity and relations between people that constitutes particularity. Words summon up universals which are perfectly real and material. Tree, for example, would continue to exist even when the last tree has 92. Hegel's logic been cut down, although some particularity would have to be involved at some stage. Likewise, university. And the tree itself is an individuality as is the thought of it. So really it doesn't matter whether you are referring to material objects in their capacity as material things existing outside of and independently of consciousness, or you insist on referring to objects whose sole existence is as thought objects, or the more usual case of material things which are endowed with meaning through their production and use in human life, and the transformation of entities from thoughts to objectifications and back to thoughts again. These categories are unaffected and work just as well. Hegel has finessed the whole ontological problem of material objects versus thought objects, and the epistemological problem posed by gaining knowledge of things in themselves. Everything that matters to us passes through consciousness, at least at the time it matters to us. Our concepts constitute our relation to the world, and our thoughts are true only insofar as they reproduce what is objective. Logic does not depend on a psychology. Subjective thought corresponds to logic only insofar as the content of thought is objective. Hegel uses a conceptual framework which allows him to focus precisely on what is invariant in the transformations between thought object and material object. Section 3. Pragmatic interpretations of the logic. I have presented a reading of Hegel's logic, in which he is understood to be talking, not about extramundane forms pre-existing human society, but rather the logic of formations of consciousness. This view does not on its own resolve all possible questions that could be raised about the ontological status of the categories of the logic itself. Hegel's claim is that they are self-construing. At any given point in defining the concepts of the logic, only concepts already defined are drawn upon. Hegel does not place the categories of the logic into some ontological category of meta-theory separate from and above the categories which are the substance of consciousness. But there is room for such an interpretation, and most so-called orthodox Hegelians today make just such an interpretation, and like Stephen Holgate, rely upon some kind of metaspace in which the categories of logic exist, separate from and prior to the activity of human beings. Forward. 93. There are intersubjective interpretations of Hegel, such as that of Robert Williams, but at least since the 1960s, all such intersubjective readings of Hegel rest on supposedly unmediated relations between human beings. It is as if, in an effort to distance themselves as far as possible from Marx, not only are means of production excluded from consideration, but the entirety of material culture as well. And of course the French interpretations have been so dominated by the master-servant narrative, that Hegel's developed thought as found in the logic is often ignored. Aside from the very many excellent appropriations of Hegel which owe their approach to Hegel to the Marxist current of thinking, an equally interesting appropriation of Hegel is that of the American pragmatists, Peirce, Dewey and Mead. Much of the wisdom about organizing and protest strategies today originated with John Dewey, who studied Hegel in the 1880s, and became a leader of the progressive movement in the U.S. His ideas on group dynamics, group problem solving and conflict resolution informed the neighborhood organizers of the 1930s, 40s and 50s, and via the peace movement of the 50s and 60s, reached the anti-corporate, environmental, anti-war movements and so on, as well as the self-help movement of the 70s and reaching the business management theory in the 80s. Dewey abandoned Hegelianism, but Hegel left his imprint on Dewey's thought not only in the developmental approach to scientific and social problems but in the philosophical foundations of the pragmatic philosophy itself. In his theories of social psychology, George Herbert Mead is much clearer in his Hegelian foundations, although Mead never acknowledged his debt to Hegel. One of the main problems in this theory is that the pragmatists took as the paradigmatic artifact the gesture. The gesture offers very limited scope for the development of a theory of consciousness really able to modernize Hegel's conception of a formation of consciousness. Although objective, like the spoken word, the gesture is tied to the presence of the agent, and blurs the distinction between the individual agent and the objective culture of the society. Cultural production would be like riding on water, limiting the conception of second nature to the cultivation of habits. Charles Sanders Peirce's concept of semiosis, sign activity, has much in common with Hegel's concept of spirit. For Peirce, signs are active in nature just as much as in culture and thought and may offer an alternative. 94. Hegel's logic. To Hegel's problematic philosophy of nature. Peirce's trichotomy of signs according to the manner in which they indicate the object, namely icon, symbol and index, has no equivalent in Hegel, although Peirce's trichotomy, qualisign, sign and legisign, corresponds to Hegel's moments of particular, individual and universal. Peirce's basic conception of the world is semiosis, that is to say, signaling or communication, and just like with Hegel's thought, Peirce's semiosis is an objective process in which individual thinkers participate.
According to Peirce, the individual is a concentrated group.
Peirce expressed antipathy towards Hegel, but one gets the impression that it was that kind of animosity which included the respect of one thinker towards another with whom he shared a great deal, including the fact that both were pathologically poor communicators. Both thinkers invented their own lexicon and constructed entire systems of idiosyncratic concepts, so mutually interrogating the writings of these two writers is challenging. Nonetheless, Peirce is a useful supplement to Hegel. If we are going to appropriate Hegel for today, we don't actually need a psychology, but we do need at least a plausible metapsychology which allows us to be clear about the ontological questions raised by an interpretation of Hegel. Section 4. Vygotsky. The School of Psychology initiated by Vygotsky and A. N. Leontiev in the Soviet Union of the 1920s owes a great deal to Hegel. The key concepts for Vygotsky and Leontiev were artifact and collaborative activity, which together constitute what Hegel would have called a formation of consciousness, or Gestalt. The idea is that people learn to control their own body and their relationship to their environment by collaborating with others in the use of artifacts, external stimuli. Through the use of artifacts, which are the bearers of cultural norms, people learn to do without the external stimulus and to do on their own what they could formerly only do with assistance. The artifact is replaced by an internal stimulus, or psychological tool. The process of internalizing the use of the artifact is a protracted process of transformation, which is of interest only to the developmental psychologist. Consequently, the mind-matter dichotomy is irrelevant in this psychology, in which every object of thought is both ideal and material, but unlike behaviorism, the psyche is regarded as perfectly real and a valid object of scientific investigation. Forward. 95. Vygotsky's most well-known work, Thinking and Speech, 1934, deals with the development of thinking with concepts from infancy up to adolescence. According to Vygotsky, it is not until adolescence that children begin to use real concepts, in the Hegelian sense, as opposed to one of about 10 transitional forms of conception that precedes the true concept. Section 5. The logic offers a rational conception of emergent social consciousness. Nowadays, the human sciences are extremely fragmented. Not only is research divided into sociology, political science, anthropology, psychology, law, history, linguistics, philosophy, criminology, etc., etc. On top of this we have fragmentation separating the different currents of thinking. Positivists, behaviorists, functionalists, structuralists, Marxists, post-structuralists, deconstructionists and so on. This situation poses severe problems for those who want to solve social problems, rather than just build an academic career for themselves. There is an urgent need for an approach which is based on critical appropriation so that different insights can be integrated in an approach which is holistic and not hampered by the individual versus social dichotomy or focused only on Toyne kinds of interaction. While no substitute for practical investigation of particulars, Hegel's logic may offer a useful approach to integration and appropriation in a terminally fragmented scientific landscape. The logic is particularly well suited to the study of emergent social movements and projects. Whenever you are dealing with a group of people organized around an idea or a social project or enterprise of some kind, then Hegel's logic is your operations manual. No community development worker, social justice activist, voluntary group organizer, political activist or academic with an overview of their subject matter should be without it. The various writers who have developed theories of group dynamics all scratch around the edges of Hegel's logic. It is a useful exercise to compare theories of group dynamics with Hegel's logic because they give insights into the logic which would otherwise be lost in Hegel's arcane exposition. But in terms of a well-developed, coherent and comprehensive theory, you can't go past the logic. Jean-Paul Sartre is someone who should be mentioned for his effort to produce something like a pragmatic reading of Hegel in his critique of dialectical reason. Sartre makes no effort to emulate the structure of 96. Hegel's logic. Hegel's logic or suggest any correspondence between his own categories and Hegel's, but the parallels are clear enough. Sartre presumes that as soon as the white heat of struggle fades from the activity of a fused group, the objectified residue of the fused group is an institution which is irrevocably dead, an object and not a subject. This exaggeration is one-sided. Critique was a useful exercise, and it would be a worthwhile exercise to try to reproduce the effort in the light of what has been learned in the years since Sartre tried it in 1960. Section 6. History and Development. The following passage in the Introduction to the Philosophy of Right explains why the history of right plays no part in the work to follow. The science of right is a part of philosophy. Hence it must develop the idea, which is the reason of an object, out of the conception. It is the same thing to say that it must regard the peculiar internal development of the thing itself. Since it is a part of philosophy, it has a definite beginning, which is the result and truth of what goes before, and this, that goes before, constitutes its so-called proof. Hence the origin of the conception of right falls outside of the science of right. Introduction to the Philosophy of Right Section 2, and he adds. In philosophic knowledge the necessity of a conception is the main thing, and the process, by which it, as a result, has come into being is the proof and deduction. After the content is seen to be necessary independently, the second point is to look about for that which corresponds to it in existing ideas and modes of speech. Introduction to the Philosophy of Right Section 2. Recapitulating what this paragraph says, the science of right must be developed out of the concept of right, bringing to light logically what is implicit in the concept of right. In this way the writer finds the distinct tie-ons which are natural to the subject matter, with the relations between all the concepts emerging from the subject matter itself, rather than being imposed arbitrarily from outside. In the logic, it is the objective logic which gives the prehistory of a concept, and we can see that the function of studying this prehistory is to arrive at clarity about the essence of the subject matter, to be able to present a simple definition which can be seen as the final result of that history. So any science has two distinct parts, and only the second is a forward. 97. Genuinely scientific treatment, the first part being just an historical justify cation for the starting point of the science. As Marx summarized this in the section known as Method of Political Economy in the Grundriss. Along the first path, the objective logic, the full conception was evaporated to yield an abstract determination. Along the second, the subjective logic, the abstract determinations lead towards a reproduction of the concrete by way of thought. In this way Hegel fell into the illusion of conceiving the real as the product of thought concentrating itself, probing its own depths, and unfolding itself out of itself, by itself, whereas the method of rising from the abstract to the concrete is only the way in which thought appropriates the concrete, reproduces it as the concrete in the mind. But this is by no means the process by which the concrete itself comes into being. For example, the simplest economic category, say e.g. exchange value, presupposes population, moreover a population producing in specific relations, as well as a certain kind of family, or commune, or state, etc. It can never exist other than as an abstract, one-sided relation within an already given, concrete, living whole. Grundriss, Marx 1857, page 100, gaining clarity about that one concept, for example, the commodity relation, which forms the starting point for a science as a long drawn-out process of appropriating the prehistory of a science, but once the correct starting point is finally arrived at, the science can be unfolded out of that concept. This kind of process is actually repeated every time a science runs into some crisis and has to be reinvented, so it turns out that the distinction between the subjective logic and the objective logic is relative. So the scientific study of some form of social practice is distinct from the study of its history. But this still leaves the question of the developmental approach, that is to say, the conviction that every concept in a science must be understood as a process whose movement is one of the forms of movement exhibited by Hegel in the various parts of the logic. The opposite simply cannot withstand Hegel's critique. Development is, after all, practical, objective critique. Section 7. Everything is both immediate and mediated. In summary, the contradictory answer to what seem to be two different avenues for acquiring knowledge, reason and intuition, is that we acquire concepts the same way we acquire the data of sense perception. Concepts have been built into our environment by our predecessors, and in using and perceiving these objects and acquiring a sensuous under. 98. Hegel's logic. Standing of their nature and interconnection with other objects we acquire conceptual knowledge. But precisely because reason is in the world in this sense, reason comes with bumps and scratches and like an old house, is constantly in need of refurbishment. Hegel's use of the structure of the syllogism, individual, particular and universal, as the basic coordinates for understanding thought objects, has the benefit that the same structure works for thought objects at whatever stage of objectification or internalization they may be at, and consequently the logic sheds light on the dynamics of formations of consciousness, whether looked at in terms of ways of life, ways of thinking or constellations of culture. 10. Critique of the Hegelian dialectic. Section 1. The spirit became a total process, pre-existing its manifestation as mentioned above. At an early stage in his development Hegel abandoned a genuinely scientific approach in which spirit was the product of human activity, and instead introduced the idea of a spirit which pre-existed human society and manifested itself in human life. Although this move is easily reversed, the resulting religious flavor penetrated deeply into the entire system. This is what Marx was getting at when he said, "History does nothing, Holy Family," section 6.2a. An example of this quasi-religious flavor in Hegel is the development of the concept described in the logic, concretizing itself until every concept merges with every other and all conflicts have been transcended in the absolute idea. Now this idea is quite adequate in indicating the form and direction of the process of concretization and objectification, but it would be an obvious mistake to take too seriously the reality of the absolute idea. As Feuerbach put it, this is the negation of theology from the standpoint of theology. Philosophy of the Future, section 21. Hegel shared with Goethe a hostility to the positivism of the natural sciences of his times, which was associated, rather unjustly, with the name of Isaac Newton. Although each of them left a legacy of considerable value for natural science, it is fair to say that both of them were mistaken in some matters as regards nature. Hegel held that there is nothing new under the sun in nature. Now this proposition can be justified. Even the physicists who theorize about the Big Bang assume that they can determine the laws of physics. Forward. 99. applicable at that time on the basis of a logical deduction from what they perceive now. Neither modern-day physicists nor Hegel suggest that no thing changes in nature. Obviously this is not the case. Hegel knew that the continents were the products of a process of geological development, but he thought that human beings appeared on new continents, complete with a characteristic physiology, as if springing from the ground. Hegel shared an idea which is still very common today, that the development of the human form can be sharply divided into two stages. Firstly, the natural process, which Hegel took to be more or less as per the Old Testament, and secondly, the cultural process. Hegel did not see any overlap or interpenetration between nature and culture in the human form and uncritically accepted the nature-culture dichotomy. Consequently, he took the relations between the sexes and between the peoples of different cultures to be more or less given by nature, rather than being a product of culture. This produced a distortion in his logic because, as can be seen in the latter parts of the section on the idea, he had to prepare in the logic the basis for a logical derivation of these relations in his philosophy of nature, that is, differences pre-existing culture and history. In the absence of any theory to explain the cultural development of the human form itself, he essentialized these differences. Obviously this has led to distortions in the logic as well as huge blind spots in his social and political theory. Conversely, in his critique of Hegel in the 1844 manuscripts, Marx makes much of the fact that Hegel gives no recognition at all for human beings as natural beings, with needs that have their source in nature. And as if that were not enough, he places the human being who is furthest removed from nature, the philosopher, at the pinnacle of the whole process. In a sense, the strength of Hegel's philosophy is that he makes human life absolutely a product of mind, but there is a real price to pay for this. Although Hegel rejected evolution in the sphere of nature, he can aptly be called a cultural evolutionist. That is, he sees history as a kind of survival of the fittest in the domain of cultural development, and his Tory.
This view of history has serious negative consequences in the understanding of cultural differences manifested in interactions between contemporaneous cultural groups in the modern world.
The way Hegel makes one grade of social practice, the truth of another, generates a clear moral hierarchy among forms of social practice. The problem here is not that one social practice is superior to another, it is always possible. 100. Hegel's logic. To make comparisons in the relative development of specific, finite modes of social practice. The problem comes when entire social formations are compared, as is the case in the phenomenology, but the logic, being concerned with projects or concepts, is not open to this criticism. If one wants to overcome the distortions of cultural evolutionism, which are by no means limited to Hegel, then Hegel provided a first-rate conceptual apparatus for doing so. Although Hegel certainly did see history as a world process, he never saw the world as a single system, so to speak, in the same way that he did see a state as a single system. He saw the domain of international relations as the animal kingdom of the spirit world, that is, a domain in which the different agents, nation-states, act in relation to one another with no mediating system of law or regulation. He was a skeptic in international law. Although the world spirit was responsible for the development of Chinese culture, Indian culture and so on, as well as European culture, the spirit moved around from place to place, and when it left a people, that people fell into stagnation and their part in history was over for the time being, at least as agents and creators in history. So the relation of a European culture to the culture it found in, say, Australia, was the relation between modern society and an historically earlier and less developed form of the same spirit. So, this is classic cultural evolutionism and needs to be negated. But this aspect of his thinking has not left any serious residue in his logic. One of the main deficits of Hegel's philosophy arises from the fact that the only social movements he knew were states and emergent states. He never knew a labor movement or a women's movement, or an anti-racist movement. Apart from states, he knew only the Enlightenment modernizing movements, religious movements of various kinds, and the institutionalization of new social practices, whether developments in technology, the economy, movements in art and literature, changes in fashion and shifts in social attitudes. The emergence of social movements which have a conscious aim to change social practices and mobilize the victims of those social practices which need to be changed, is something he might have learned a great deal from, but the kind of relations and problems that are involved in such movements he was never able to take into account. This fact is interesting in the light of the fact that Hegel became convinced that poverty was endemic in capitalism, and that the market would forward 101 invariably function to exacerbate poverty and inequality, and generate the kind of social problems associated with economic injustice. It remained one of the few unresolved contradictions, loose threads, in his system. Nevertheless, his logic provides excellent material for tackling these problems. Section 2. Hegel made history conform to the logic, rather than vice versa. One of the problems with Hegel's system becomes evident when we turn to his works on history and the history of philosophy. Despite clear claims to the contrary in the logic, Hegel succumbs all too often and too easily to the temptation to fiddle with historical facts and the stated views of his protagonists, to make them fit into a pre-existing schema. It is always the danger of any powerful ideological system, that it tends to consume rather than foster its environment. Even in the early stages of the logic we found that the succession of early Greek philosophers, even as Hegel knew them, did not fit into the schema suggested by the logic. While he is meticulous with his critique of Kant, he is very blasé with his critique of Fichte, for example. He turned out to be an unreliable historian of ideas, even though the philosophy of history which he wrote does not justify these distortions. But this is a warning for us. A knowledge of the logic, which provides us with a lens of a certain hue when we follow events around us, can inadvertently lead us to distort what we see. But this is a danger inherent in any theory, and Hegel would be the first to warn us of this and, what is more, explain to us in detail how that distortion works. One obvious case of this may be the philosophy of right, where Hegel claims to arrive at a constitutional monarchy by a process of logic. All that is real may well be rational, but many would say that he went too far in ascribing logical necessity to constitutional monarchy. Intelligibility easily slips over into rationalization. Section 3. Marx made innovations. Activity, alienation, abstraction, production. Marx was a lot closer to Hegel in philosophy than is commonly realized. The sketch of the origins of conceptual thought in labor presented in the System of Ethical Life could easily be mistaken for the work of Marx or Engels, rather than Hegel. But even though Marx and Hegel's lives overlapped, in a strong sense Marx belongs to a different era. Whereas 102. Hegel's logic. Hegel never knew a movement of the oppressed. One such movement, the labor movement, was Marx's principal inspiration. So when Marx says, "History does nothing, it possesses no immense wealth, it wages no battles. It is man, real, living man who does all that. History is nothing but the activity of man pursuing his aims." The Holy Family, Part 6, 2a. He is denouncing this deification of history as well as all iron laws of history in shaping events. It is certainly a condemnation of system building of the type that Hegel dedicated himself to from the philosophy of spirit of 1805 to 06 onwards. It can also be understood as a call to take Hegel back to his original thesis of spirit as the nature of human beings en masse. Consider this well-known line from the German ideology. The premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity and the material conditions under which they live, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. These premises can thus be verified in a purely empirical way. German Ideology, Part 1, Section 1a. This is a precise statement of the kind of interpretation of spirit advocated here, a pragmatic interpretation of Hegel's logical syllogism. Real individuals, their activity and the material conditions, i.e., the individual, particular and universal. The theses on Feuerbach spell out an interpretation of Hegel in which real individuals, their activity and the material conditions have been put in the place of spirit. And it should be remembered that in these theses, Marx supports Hegel against Feuerbach. The famous excerpt from the Grundrisse on the method of political economy, concerning the relation of abstract and concrete, is also pure Hegel, as is the structure of capital, beginning with the commodity, the cell of capitalist relations, and then self-consciously unfolding from the concept of commodity, the contradictions of capitalist society. Pure Hegel. There are also a couple of elements of Marx which are not to be found in Hegel, but which seem so Hegelian that many people think they come from Hegel. Firstly, alienation. Alienation, as the experience of one's own labor becoming the property of a hostile and exploiting class, is a discovery of. Forward. 103. Marx, not Hegel. A present-day Hegelian, like Derrida, would see all production as objectification and give no special status to the exploitation of wage labor. Secondly, the idea of abstraction as an objective process, namely the money relation, is a discovery of Marx, not Hegel. Thirdly, although it is seen that Hegel's original insight at a kind of anthropology of labor, Hegel never went on to emphasize the production and reproduction of material life as having a privileged position in the formation of mind, and this claim is a discovery of Marx. Hegel's idea of skeptical logical critique of the criteria of knowledge, as found in the Phenomenology, goes to the other extreme. This is probably a case of the truth being somewhere in the middle. Fourthly, although Hegel's advocacy of the state needs to be understood in the context of the viewpoint of a people without a state, that is, the state is a social movement, this certainly was not Marx's view. Marx did base himself squarely and consistently on social movements as the vehicle of emancipation, and was hostile, not only to Hegel's constitutional monarchy, but states in general, although it has to be said, he never worked out an alternative in any definite shape. But these differences should not obscure the huge debt that Marx owed to Hegel. Altogether, of all Hegel's works, it is the logic which is the least tainted by the defects in Hegel's philosophy and the most too fair for contemporary appropriation. Or as Lenin put it, in this most idealistic of Hegel's works there is the least idealism and the most materialism. Contradictory, but a fact. Lenin C.W., Volume 38, Section 4. Nature is intelligible, but it is also independent of human activity. Finally, the question of a dialectics of nature. According to Hegel at the conclusion of the logic, the idea, in positing itself as absolute unity of the pure notion and its reality and thus contracting itself into the immediacy of being, is the totality in this form, nature. Science of Logic Section 1817. Thus the logic is a circle, returning to its point of origin, being, but now not as bare, abstract immediacy, but an indeterminacy which is pregnant with all the richness of nature. But Hegel's idea is that the logic exists in nature as its intelligibility, not its forms of movement as such. It is through a labor process and the study of nature that spirit manifests itself in the form of consciousness. 104. Hegel's logic. People who talk about a dialectics of nature usually have in mind just the categories of being, quality, quantity and measure and perhaps the moments of reflection. It is hard to disagree with the claim that movement, opposition, reflection and so on, exist in nature, that is, that nature moves, changes, reflects in the sense of leaving meaningful traces, and so on. Such a claim is similar to Peirce's conception of semiosis as a natural process. But to go beyond this, for example, to talk about the dialectic of form and content, or any of the categories of subjectivity, is stretching the point too far. These are obviously categories of thought. The later categories of the idea, like chemism, or living individual in life, certainly begin to look like categories of nature, but here we have a movement from thought to nature, not the other way around. So the idea of a dialectics of nature represents a big misunderstanding and actually has acted as a barrier to popular understanding of dialectics, not a help. Forward. 105. Note on the text. The text to follow is a reprint of the Logic of Hegel, translated from the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences by William Wallace, first published in 1873, and certainly the most widely read and influential of Hegel's works in the English language until interest amongst English speakers turned to the phenomenology in recent years. Wallace often loosely paraphrased Hegel's original text, and included the Zusatz, notes, of Hegel's student Leopold von Henning using his own notes and those of Hotho, Michelet and Geyer supplemented by his recollections of what Hegel had actually said. Consequently, this text does not have the authority and reliability of A. V. Miller's authoritative translation of the published text of the Science of Logic of 1812–1816. Nonetheless, Wallace's translation is immensely readable and is far superior to any other English translation of Hegel's works produced in the first century after Hegel's death. This text reflects the content of Hegel's lectures on the encyclopedia up till the time of his death. It is simpler than the original Science of Logic, less detailed in parts and avoids most of the excursuses of the longer work, but there is no significant change in the overall structure and intent. This work is generally known as the Shorter Logic, in contrast to the 1812–1816 work which is known as the Science of Logic. Wallace provided a number of footnotes, but these have been omitted from this edition. The spelling has been Americanized and some additional headings not affecting the paragraph numbering have been added. Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. Third and final edition, by G. W. F. Hegel 1830. Translated by William Wallace, first published 1873. Introduction. Section 1 Philosophy misses an advantage enjoyed by the other sciences. It cannot like them rest the existence of its objects on the natural admis science of consciousness, nor can it assume that its method of cognition, either for starting or for continuing, is one already accepted. The objects of philosophy, it is true, are upon the whole the same as those of religion. In both the object is truth, in that supreme sense in which God and God only is the truth. Both in like manner go on to treat of the finite worlds of nature and the human mind, with their relation to each other and to their truth in God. Some acquaintance with its objects, therefore, philosophi may and even must presume, that in a certain interest in them to boot, were it for no other reason than this, that in point of time the mind makes general images of objects, long before it makes notions of them, and that it is only through these mental images, and by recourse to them, that the thinking mind rises to know and comprehend thinkingly. But with the rise of this thinking study of things, it soon becomes evident that thought will be satisfied with nothing short of showing the necessity of its facts, of demonstrating the existence of its objects, as well as their nature and qualities. Our original acquaintance with them is thus discovered to be inadequate. We can assume nothing and assert nothing dogmatically, nor can we accept the assertions and assumptions of others. And yet we must make a beginning, and a beginning, as primary and underived, makes an assumption, or rather is an assumption. It seems as if it were impossible to make a beginning at all. Section 2. This thinking study of things may serve, in a general way, as a description of philosophy. But the description is too wide. If it be correct to say, that thought makes the distinction between man and the lower animals, then everything human is human, for the sole and simple reason that it is due. 108. Hegel's logic. To the operation of thought. Philosophy, on the other hand, is a peculiar mode of thinking, a mode in which thinking becomes knowledge, and knowledge through notions. However great therefore may be the identity and essential unity of the two modes of thought, the philosophic mode gets to be different from the more general thought which acts in all that is human, in all that gives humanity its distinctive character. And this difference connects itself with the fact that the strictly human and thought-induced phenomena of consciousness do not originally appear in the form of a thought, but as a feeling, a perception, or mental image, all of which aspects must be distinguished from the form of thought proper. According to an old preconceived idea, which has passed into a trivial proposition, it is thought which marks the man off from the animals. Yet trivial as this old belief may seem, it must, strangely enough, be recalled to mind in presence of certain preconceived ideas of the present day. These ideas would put feeling and thought so far apart as to make them opposites, and would represent them as so antagonistic, that feeling, particularly religious feeling, is supposed to be contaminated, perverted, and even annihilated by thought. They also emphatically hold that religion and piety grow out of, and rest upon something else, and not on thought. But those who make this separation forget meanwhile that only man has the capacity for religion, and that animals no more have religion than they have law and morality. Those who insist on this separation of religion from thinking usually have before their minds the sort of thought that may be styled afterthought. They mean reflective thinking, which has to deal with thoughts as thoughts, and brings them into consciousness. Slackness to perceive and keep in view this distinction which philosophy definitely draws in respect of thinking is the source of the crudest objections and reproaches against philosophy. Man, and that just because it is his nature to think, is the only being that possesses law, religion, and morality. In these spheres of human life, therefore, thinking, under the guise of feeling, faith, or generalized image, has not been inactive. Its action and its productions are there present and therein contained. But it is one thing to have such feelings and generalized images that have been molded and permeated by thought, and another thing to have thoughts about them. The thoughts, to which afterthought upon those modes of consciousness gives rise, are what is comprised under reflection, general reasoning, and the like, as well as under philosophy itself. Introduction. 109. The neglect of this distinction between thought in general and the reflective thought of philosophy has also led to another and more frequent misunderstanding. Reflection of this kind has been often maintained to be the condition, or even the only way, of attaining a consciousness and certitude of the eternal and true. The, now somewhat antiquated, metaphysical proofs of God's existence, for example, have been treated, as if a knowledge of them and a conviction of their truth were the only and essential means of producing a belief and conviction that there is a God. Such a doctrine would find its parallel, if we said that eating was impossible before we had acquired a knowledge of the chemical, botanical, and zoological characters of our food, and that we must delay digestion till we had finished the study of anatomy and physiology. Were it so, these sciences in their field, like philosophy in its, would gain greatly in point of utility. In fact, their utility would rise to the height of absolute and universal indispensableness. Or rather, instead of being indispensable, they would not exist at all. Section 3. The content, of whatever kind it be, with which our consciousness is taken up, is what constitutes the qualitative character of our feelings, perceptions, fancies, and ideas, of our aims and duties, and of our thoughts and notions. From this point of view, feeling, perception, etc., are the forms assumed by these contents. The contents remain one and the same, whether they are felt, seen, represented, or willed, and whether they are merely felt, or felt with an admixture of thoughts, or merely and simply thought. In any one of these forms, or in the admixture of several, the contents confront consciousness, or its object. But when they are thus objects of consciousness, the modes of the several forms ally themselves with the contents, and each form of them appears in consequence to give rise to a special object. Thus what is the same at bottom may look like a different sort of fact. The several modes of feeling, perception, desire, and will, so far as we are aware of them, are in general called ideas, mental representations. And it may be roughly said that philosophy puts thoughts, categories, or, in more precise language, adequate notions, in the place of the generalized images we ordinarily call ideas. Mental impressions such as these may be regarded as the metaphors of thoughts and notions. But to have these figurate conceptions does not imply that we appreciate their intellectual significance, the thoughts and rational notions to which they correspond. 110. Hegel's logic. Conversely, it is one thing to have thoughts and intelligent notions, and another to know what impressions, perceptions, and feelings correspond to them. This difference will to some extent explain what people call the unintelligibility of philosophy. Their difficulty lies partly in an incapacity, which in itself is nothing but one of habit, for abstract thinking, i.e. in an inability to get hold of pure thoughts and move about in them. In our ordinary state of mind, the thoughts are clothed upon and made one with the sensuous or spiritual material of the hour, and in reflection, meditation, and general reasoning, we introduce a blend of thoughts into feelings, percepts, and mental images. Thus, in propositions where the subject matter is due to the senses, e.g. this leaf is green, we have such categories introduced, as being and individuality. But it is a very different thing to make the thoughts pure and simple our object. But their complaint that philosophy is unintelligible is as much due to another reason, and that is an impatient wish to have before them as a mental picture that which is in the mind as a thought or notion. When people are asked to apprehend some notion, they often complain that they do not know what they have to think. But the fact is that in a notion there is nothing further to be thought than the notion itself. What the phrase reveals is a hankering after an image with which we are already familiar. The mind, denied the use of its familiar ideas, feels the ground where it once stood firm and at home taken away from beneath it, and, when transported into the region of pure thought, cannot tell where in the world it is. One consequence of this weakness is that authors, preachers, and orators are found most intelligible, when they speak of things which their readers or hearers already know by rote, things which the latter are conversant with, and which require no explanation. Section 4. The philosopher then has to reckon with popular modes of thought, and with the objects of religion. In dealing with the ordinary modes of mind, he will first of all, as we saw, have to prove and almost to awaken the need for his peculiar method of knowledge. In dealing with the objects of religion, and with truth as a whole, he will have to show that philosophy is capable of apprehending them from its own resources, and Introduction. 111. Should a difference from religious conceptions come to light, he will have to justify the points in which it diverges. Section 5. To give the reader a preliminary explanation of the distinction thus made, and to let him see at the same moment that the real import of our consciousness is retained, and even for the first time put in its proper light, when translated into the form of thought and the notion of reason, it may be well to recall another of these old unreasoned beliefs. And that is the conviction that to get at the truth of any object or event, even of feelings, perceptions, opinions, and mental ideas, we must think it over. Now in any case to think things over is at least to transform feelings, ordinary ideas, etc. into thoughts. Nature has given everyone a faculty of thought. But thought is all that philosophy claims is the form proper to her business, and thus the inadequate view which ignores the distinction stated in Section 3 leads to a new delusion, the reverse of the complaint previously mentioned about the unintelligibility of philosophy. In other words, this science must often submit to the sleight of hearing even people who have never taken any trouble with it, talking as if they thoroughly understood all about it. With no preparation beyond an ordinary education, they do not hesitate, especially under the influence of religious sentiment, to philosophize and to criticize philosophy. Everybody allows that to know any other science you must have first studied it, and that you can only claim to express a judgment upon it in virtue of such knowledge. Everybody allows that to make a shoe you must have learned and practiced the craft of the shoemaker, though every man has a model in his own foot, and possesses in his hands the natural endowments for the operations required. For philosophy alone, it seems to be imagined, such study, care, and application are not in the least requisite. This comfortable view of what is required for a philosopher has recently received corroboration through the theory of immediate or intuitive knowledge. Section 6. So much for the form of philosophical knowledge. It is no less desirable, on the other hand, that philosophy should understand that its content is no other than actuality, that core of truth which, originally product in producing itself within the precincts of the mental life, has 112. Hegel's logic. Become the world, the inward and outward world, of consciousness. At first we become aware of these contents in what we call experience. But even experience, as it surveys the wide range of inward and outward existence, has sense enough to distinguish the mere appearance, which is transient and meaningless, from what in itself really deserves the name of actuality. As it is only in form that philosophy is distinguished from other modes of attaining an acquaintance with the same sum of being, it must necessarily be in harmony with actuality and experience. In fact, this harmony may be viewed as at least an extrinsic means of testing the truth of a philosophy. Similarly, it may be held the highest and final aim of philosophic science to bring about, through the ascertainment of this harmony, a reconciliation of the self-conscious reason with the reason which is in the world, in other words, with actuality. In the preface to my Philosophy of Right, page she, are found the propositions. What is reasonable is actual, and what is actual is reasonable. These simple statements have given rise to expressions of surprise and hostility, even in quarters where it would be reckoned an insult to presume absence of philosophy, and still more of religion. Religion at least need not be brought in evidence. Its doctrines of the divine governments of the world affirm these propositions too decidedly. For their philosophic sense, we must presuppose intelligence enough to know, not only that God is actual, that he is the supreme actuality, that he alone is truly actual, but also, as regards the logical bearings of the question, that existence is in part mere appearance, and only in part actuality. In common life, any freak of fancy, any error, evil and everything of the nature of evil, as well as every degenerate and transitory existence whatever, gets in a casual way the name of actuality. But even our ordinary feelings are enough to forbid a casual, fortuitous, existence getting the emphatic name of an actual, for by fortuitous we mean an existence which has no greater value than that of something possible, which may as well not be as be. As for the term actuality, these critics would have done well to consider the sense in which I employ it. In a detailed logic I had treated among other things of actuality, and accurately distinguished it not only from the fortuitous, which, after all, has existence, but even from the cognate categories of existence and the other modifications of being. Introduction. 113. The actuality of the rational stands opposed by the popular fancy that ideas and ideals are nothing but chimeras, and philosophy a mere system of such phantasms. It is also opposed by the very different fancy that ideas and ideals are something far too excellent to have actuality, or something too impotent to procure it for themselves. This divorce between idea and reality is especially dear to the analytic understanding which looks upon its own abstractions, dreams though they are, as something true and real, and prides itself on the imperative, ought, which it takes a special pleasure in prescribing even on the field of politics. As if the world had waited on it to learn how it ought to be, and was not.
For, if it were as it ought to be, what would come of the precocious wisdom of that ought?
When understanding turns this ought against trivial external and transitory objects, against social regulations or conditions, which very likely possess a great relative importance for a certain time in special circles, it may often be right. In such a case the intelligent observer may meet much that fails to satisfy the general requirements of right. For who is not acute enough to see a great deal in his own surroundings which is really far from being as it ought to be? But such acuteness is mistaken in the conceit that, when it examines these objects and pronounces what they ought to be, it is dealing with questions of philosophic science. The object of philosophy is the idea, and the idea is not so impotent as merely to have a right or an obligation to exist without a truly existing. The object of philosophy is an actuality of which those objects, social regulations and conditions, are only the superficial outside. Section 7. Thus reflection, thinking things over, in a general way involves the principle, which also means the beginning, of philosophy. And when the reflective spirit arose again in its independence in modern times, after the epoch of the Lutheran Reformation, it did not, as in its beginnings among the Greeks, stand merely aloof, in a world of its own, but at once turned its energies also upon the apparently illimitable material of the phenomenal world. In this way the name philosophy came to be applied to all those branches of knowledge, which are engaged in ascertaining the standard and universal in the ocean of empirical individualities, as well as in ascertaining the necessary element, or laws, to be found in the apparent disorder of the endless masses of the fortuitous. It thus appears that modern philosophy derives its materials from our own personal observations and perceptions of the external and internal world, from nature as 114. Hegel's logic. Well as from the mind and heart of man, when both stand in the immediate presence of the observer. This principle of experience carries with it the unspeakably important condition that, in order to accept and believe any fact, we must be in contact with it, or, in more exact terms, that we must find the fact united and combined with the certainty of our own selves. We must be in touch with our subject matter, whether it be by means of our external senses, or, else, by our profounder mind and our intimate self-consciousness. This principle is the same as that which has in the present day been termed faith, immediate knowledge, the revelation in the outward world, and, above all, in our own heart. Those sciences, which thus got the name of philosophy, we call empirical sciences, for the reason that they take their departure from experience. Still the essential results which they aim at and provide are laws, general propositions, a theory, the thoughts of what is found existing. On this ground the Newtonian physics was called natural philosophy. Hugo Grotius, again, by putting together and comparing the behavior of states towards each other as recorded in history, succeeded, with the help of the ordinary methods of general reasoning, in laying down certain general principles, and establishing a theory which may be termed the philosophy of international law. In England this is still the usual signification of the term philosophy. Newton continues to be celebrated as the greatest of philosophers, and the name goes down as far as the price lists of instrument makers. All instruments, such as the thermometer and barometer, which do not come under the special head of magnetic or electric apparatus, are styled philosophical instruments. Surely thought, and not a mere combination of wood, iron, etc., ought to be called the instrument of philosophy. The recent science of political economy in particular, which in Germany is known as rational economy of the state, or intelligent national economy, has in England especially appropriated the name of philosophy. Section 8. In its own field this empirical knowledge may at first give satisfaction. But in two ways it is seen to come short. In the first place there is another circle of objects which it does not embrace. These are freedom, spirit, and God. They belong to a different sphere, not because it can be said that they have nothing to do with experience, for though they are CER. Introduction. 115. Toinly not experiences of the senses, it is quite an identical proposition to say that whatever is in consciousness is experienced. The real ground for assigning them to another field of cognition is that in their scope and content these objects evidently show themselves as infinite. There is an old phrase often wrongly attributed to Aristotle, and supposed to express the general tenor of his philosophy. Nihil est in intellectu quod non furit in sensu. There is nothing in thought which has not been in sense and experience. If speculative philosophy refused to admit this maxim, it can only have done so from a misunderstanding. It will, however, on the converse side no less assert, nihil est in sensu quod non furit in intellectu. And this may be taken in two senses. In the general sense it means that nous or spirit, the more profound idea of nous in modern thought, is the cause of the world. In its special meaning, see section 2, it asserts that the sentiment of right, morals, and religion is a sentiment, and in that way an experience, of such scope and such character that it can spring from and rest upon thought alone. Section 9. But in the second place in point of form the subjective reason desires a further satisfaction than empirical knowledge gives. And this form is, in the widest sense of the term, necessity. Section 1. The method of empirical science exhibits two defects. The first is that the universal or general principle contained in it, the genus, or kind, etc., is, on its own account, indeterminate and vague, and therefore not on its own account connected with the particulars or the details. Either is external and accidental to the other, and it is the same with the particular facts which are brought into union. Each is external and accidental to the others. The second defect is that the beginnings are in every case data and postulates, neither accounted for nor deduced. In both these points the form of necessity fails to get its due. Hence reflection, whenever it sets itself to remedy these defects, becomes speculative thinking, the thinking proper to philosophy. As a species of reflection, therefore, which, though it has a certain community of nature with the reflection already mention, is nevertheless different from it, philosophic thought thus possesses, in addition to the common forms, some forms of its own, of which the notion may be taken as the type. 116. Hegel's logic. The relation of speculative science to the other sciences may be stated in the following terms. It does not in the least neglect the empirical facts contained in the several sciences, but recognizes and adopts them. It appreciates and applies towards its own structure the universal element in these sciences, their laws and classifications. But besides all this, into the categories of science it introduces, and gives currency to, other categories. The difference, looked at in this way, is only a change of categories. Speculative logic contains all previous logic in metaphysics. It preserves the same forms of thought, the same laws and objects, while at the same time remodeling and expanding them with wider categories. From notion in the speculative sense we should distinguish what is ordinarily called a notion. The phrase, that no notion can ever comprehend the infinite, a phrase which has been repeated over and over again till it has grown axiomatic, is based upon this narrow estimate of what is meant by notions. Section 1. 0. This thought, which is proposed as the instrument of philosophic knowledge, itself calls for further explanation. We must understand in what way it possesses necessity or cogency, and when it claims to be equal to the task of apprehending the absolute objects, God, Spirit, freedom, that claim must be substantiated. Such an explanation, however, is itself a lesson in philosophy, and properly falls within the scope of the science itself. A preliminary attempt to make matters plain would only be unphilosophical, and consist of a tissue of assumptions, assertions, and inferential pros and cons, i.e. of dogmatism without cogency, as against which there would be an equal right of counter-dogmatism. A main line of argument in the critical philosophy bids us pause before proceeding to inquire into God or into the true being of things, and tells us first of all to examine the faculty of cognition and see whether it is equal to such an effort. We ought, says Kant, to become acquainted with the instrument, before we undertake the work for which it is to be employed, for if the instrument be insufficient, all our trouble will be spent in vain. The plausibility of this suggestion has won for it general assent and admiration, the result of which has been to withdraw cognition from an interest in its objects and absorption in the study of them, and to direct it back upon itself, and so turn it to a question of form. Unless we wish to be deceived by words, it is easy to see what this amounts to. In Introduction. 117. The case of other instruments, we can try and criticize them in other ways than by setting about the special work for which they are destined. But the examination of knowledge can only be carried out by an act of knowledge. To examine this so-called instrument is the same thing as to know it. But to seek to know before we know is as absurd as the wise resolution of Scholasticus, not to venture into the water until he had learned to swim. Reinhold saw the confusion with which this style of commencement is chargeable, and tried to get out of the difficulty by starting with a hypothetical and problematical stage of philosophizing. In this way he supposed that it would be possible, nobody can tell how, to get along, until we found ourselves, further on, arrived at the primary truth of truths. His method, when closely looked into, will be seen to be identical with a very common practice. It starts from a substratum of experiential fact, or from a provisional assumption which has been brought into a definition, and then proceeds to analyze this starting point. We can detect in Reinhold's argument a perception of the truth, that the usual course which proceeds by assumptions and anticipations is no better than a hypothetical and problematical mode of procedure. But his perceiving this does not alter the character of this method, it only makes clear its imperfect tions. Section 11. The special conditions which call for the existence of philosophy may be thus described. The mind or spirit, when it is sentient or perceptive, finds its object in something sensuous, when it imagines, in a picture or image, when it wills, in an aim or end.
But in contrast to, or it may be only in distinction from, these forms of its existence and of its objects, the mind has also to gratify the cravings of its highest and most inward life.
That innermost self is thought. Thus the mind renders thought its object. In the best meaning of the phrase, it comes to itself, for thought is its principle, and its very unadulterated self. But while thus occupied, thought entangles itself in contradictions, i.e. loses itself in the hard and fast non-identity of its thoughts, and so, instead of reaching itself, is caught and held in its counterpart. This result, to which honest but narrow thinking leads the mere understanding, is resisted by the loftier craving of which we have spoken. That craving expresses the perseverance of thought, which continues true to itself, even in this conscious loss. 118. Hegel's logic. Of its native rest and independence, that it may overcome, and work out in itself the solution of its own contradictions. To see that thought in its very nature is dialectical, and that, as understanding, it must fall into contradiction, the negative of itself, will form one of the main lessons of logic. When thought grows hopeless of ever achieving, by its own means, the solution of the contradiction which it has by its own action brought upon itself, it turns back to those solutions of the question with which the mind had learned to pacify itself in some of its other modes and forms. Unfortunately, however, the retreat of thought has led it, as Plato noticed even in his time, to a very uncalled for hatred of reason, misology, and it then takes up against its own endeavors that hostile attitude of which an example is seen in the doctrine that immediate knowledge, as it is called, is the exclusive form in which we become cognizant of truth. Section 1. 2. The rise of philosophy is due to these cravings of thought. Its point of departure is experience, including under that name both our immediate consciousness and the inductions from it. Awakened, as it were, by this stimulus, thought is vitally characterized by raising itself above the natural state of mind, above the senses and inferences from the senses into its own unadulterated element, and by assuming, accordingly, at first a stand aloof and negative attitude towards the point from which it started. Through this state of antagonism to the phenomena of sense, its first satisfaction is found in itself, in the idea of the universal essence of these phenomena, an idea, the absolute, or God, which may be more or less abstract. Meanwhile, on the other hand, the sciences, based on experience, exert upon the mind a stimulus to overcome the form in which their varied contents are presented, and to elevate these contents to the rank of necessary truth. For the facts of science have the aspect of a vast conglomerate, one thing coming side by side with another, as if they were merely given and presented, as in short devoid of all essential or necessary connection. In consequence of this stimulus, thought is dragged out of its unrealized universality and its fancied or merely possible satisfaction, and impelled onwards to a development from itself. On one hand, this development only means that thought incorporates the contents of science, in all their speciality of detail as submitted. On the other, it makes these contents imitate the action of the original creative thought, and Introduction. 119. Sent the aspect of a free evolution determined by the logic of the fact alone. On the relation between immediacy and mediation in consciousness we shall speak later, expressly and with more detail. Here it may be sufficient to premise that, though the two moments, or factors present themselves as distinct, still neither of them can be absent, nor can one exist apart from the other. Thus the knowledge of God, as of every supersensible reality, is in its true character an exaltation above sensations or perceptions. It consequently involves a negative attitude to the initial data of sense, and to that extent implies mediation. For to mediate is to take something as a beginning and to go onward to a second thing, so that the existence of this second thing depends on our having reached it from something else contradistinguished from it. In spite of this, the knowledge of God is no mere sequel, dependent on the empirical phase of consciousness. In fact, its independence is essentially secured through this negation and exaltation. No doubt, if we attach an unfair prominence to the fact of mediation, and represent it as implying a state of conditionness, it may be said, not that the remark would mean much, that philosophy is the child of experience, and owes its rise to a posteriori fact. As a matter of fact, thinking is always the negation of what we have immediately before us. With as much truth, however, we may be said to owe eating to the means of nourishment, so long as we can have no eating without them. If we take this view, eating is certainly represented as ungrateful. It devours that to which it owes itself. Thinking, upon this view of its action, is equally ungrateful. But there is also an a priori aspect of thought, whereby a mediation, not made by anything external but by a reflection into self, we have that immediacy which is universality, the self-complacency of thought which is so much at home with itself that it feels an innate indifference to descend to particulars, and in that way to the development of its own nature. It is thus also with religion, which whether it be rude or elaborate, whether it be invested with scientific precision of detail or confined to the simple faith of the heart, possesses, throughout, the same intensive nature of contentment and felicity. But if thought never gets further than the universality of the ideas, as was perforce the case in the first philosophies, when the Eleatics never got beyond being, or Heraclitus beyond becoming, it is justly open to the charge of formalism. Even in a more advanced phase of philosophy, we may often find a doctrine which has mastered merely certain abstract propositions or formulae, such as, in 120. Hegel's logic. The absolute all is one, subject and object are identical, and only repeating the same thing when it comes to particulars. Bearing in mind this first period of thought, the period of mere generality, we may safely say that experience is the real author of growth and advance in philosophy. For, firstly, the empirical sciences do not stop short at the mere observation of the individual features of a phenomenon. By the aid of thought, they are able to meet philosophy with materials prepared for it, in the shape of general uniformities, i.e. laws, and classifications of the phenomena. When this is done, the particular facts which they contain are ready to be received into philosophy. This, secondly, implies a certain compulsion on thought itself to proceed to these concrete specific truths. The reception into philosophy of these scientific materials, now that thought has removed their immediacy and made them cease to be mere data, forms at the same time a development of thought out of itself. Philosophy, then, owes its development to the empirical sciences. In return it gives their contents what is so vital to them, the freedom of thought, gives them, in short, an a priori character. These contents are now warranted necessary, and no longer depend on the evidence of facts merely, that they were so found and so experienced. The fact as experience thus becomes an illustration and a copy of the original and completely self-supporting activity of thought. Section 1. 3 stated in exact terms, such as the origin and development of philosophy. But the history of philosophy gives us the same process from a historical and external point of view. The stages in the evolution of the idea there seem to follow each other by accident, and to present merely a number of different and unconnected principles, which the several systems of philosophy carry out in their own way. But it is not so. For these thousands of years the same architect has directed the work, and that architect is the one living mind whose nature is to think, to bring to self-consciousness what it is, and, with its being thus set as object before it, to be at the same time raised above it, and so to reach a higher stage of its own being. The different systems which the history of philosophy presents are therefore not irreconcilable with unity. We may either say, that it is one philosophy at different degrees of maturity, or that the particular principle, which is the groundwork of each system, is but a branch of one and the same universe of thought. In philosophy the latest birth of time is the result of all the systems that have. Introduction. 121. Preceded it, and must include their principles, and so, if, on other grounds, it deserve the title of philosophy, will be the fullest, most comprehensive, and most adequate system of all. The spectacle of so many and so various systems of philosophy suggests the necessity of defining more exactly the relation of universal to particular. When the universal is made a mere form and coordinated with the particular, as if it were on the same level, it sinks into a particular itself. Even common sense in everyday matters is above the absurdity of setting a universal beside the particulars. Would anyone, who wished for fruit, reject cherries, pears, and grapes, on the ground that they were cherries, pears, or grapes, and not fruit? But when philosophy is encased on, the excuse of many is that philosophies are so different, and none of them is the philosophy, that each is only a philosophy. Such a plea is as some to justify any amount of contempt for philosophy. And yet cherries too are fruit. Often, too, a system, of which the principle is the universal, is put on a level with another of which the principle is a particular, and with theories which deny the existence of philosophy altogether. Such systems are said to be only different views of philosophy. With equal justice, light and darkness might be styled different kinds of light. Section 1. For the same evolution of thought which is exhibited in the history of philosophy is presented in the system of philosophy itself. Here, instead of surveying the process, as we do in history, from the outside, we see the movement of thought clearly defined in its native medium. The thought, which is genuine and self-supporting, must be intrinsically concrete. It must be an idea, and when it is viewed in the whole of its universality, it is the idea, or the absolute. The science of this idea must form a system. For the truth is concrete. That is, while it gives a bond and principle of unity, it also possesses an internal source of development. Truth, then, is only possible as a universe or totality of thought, and the freedom of the whole, as well as the necessity of the several subdivisions, which it implies, are only possible when these are discriminated and defined. Unless it is a system, a philosophy is not a scientific production. Unsystematic philosophizing can only be expected to give expression to personal peculiarities of mind, and has no principle for the regulation of its contents. Apart from their interdependence and organic union, the truths of philosophy are valueless, and must then be treated as baseless. 122. Hegel's logic. Hypotheses, or personal convictions. Yet many philosophical treatises confine themselves to such an exposition of the opinions and sentiments of the author. The term system is often misunderstood. It does not denote a philosophy, the principle of which is narrow and to be distinguished from others. On the contrary, a genuine philosophy makes it a principle to include every particular principle. Section 1. 5. Each of the parts of philosophy is a philosophical whole, a circle rounded and complete in itself. In each of these parts, however, the philosophical idea is found in a particular specificality or medium. The single circle, because it is a real totality, bursts through the limits imposed by its special medium, and gives rise to a wider circle. The whole of philosophy in this way resembles a circle of circles. The idea appears in each single circle, but, at the same time, the whole idea is constituted by the system of these peculiar phases, and each is a necessary member of the organization. Section 1. 6. In the form of an encyclopedia, the science has no room for a detailed exposition of particulars, and must be limited to setting forth the commencement of the special sciences and the notions of cardinal importance in them. How much of the particular parts is requisite to constitute a particular branch of knowledge is so far indeterminate, that the part, if it is to be something true, must be not an isolated member merely, but itself an organic whole. The entire field of philosophy therefore really forms a single science, but it may also be viewed as a total, composed of several particular sciences. The Encyclopedia of Philosophy must not be confounded with ordinary encyclopedias. An ordinary encyclopedia does not pretend to be more than an aggregation of sciences, regulated by no principle, and merely as experience offers them. Sometimes it even includes what merely bear the name of sciences, while they are nothing more than a collection of bits of information. In an aggregate like this, the several branches of knowledge owe their place in the encyclopedia to extrinsic reasons, and their unity is therefore artificial. They are arranged, but we cannot say they form a system. For the same reason, especially as the mate. Introduction. 123.
Reals to be combined also depend upon no one rule or principle. The AR arrangement is at best an experiment, and will always exhibit inequalities.
An encyclopedia of philosophy excludes three kinds of partial science. It excludes mere aggregates of bits of information. Philology in its prima facie aspect belongs to this class. 2. It rejects the quasi-sciences, which are founded on an act of arbitrary will alone, such as heraldry. Sciences of this class are positive from beginning to end. 3. In another class of sciences, also styled positive, but which have a rational basis and a rational beginning, philosophy claims that constituent as its own. The positive features remain the property of the sciences themselves. The positive element in the last class of sciences is of different sorts. Their commencement, though rational at bottom, yields to the influence of fortuitousness, when they have to bring their universal truth into contact with actual facts and the single phenomena of experience. In this region of chance and change, the adequate notion of science must yield its place to reasons or grounds of explanation. Thus, e.g. in the science of jurisprudence, or in the system of direct and indirect taxation, it is necessary to have certain points precisely and definitively settled which lie beyond the competence of the absolute lines laid down by the pure notion. A certain latitude of settlement accordingly is left, and each point may be determined in one way on one principle, in another way on another, and admits of no definitive certainty. Similarly, the idea of nature, when parceled out in detail, is dissipated into contingencies. Natural history, geography, and medicine stumble upon descriptions of existence, upon kinds and distinctions, which are not determined by reason, but by sport and adventitious incidents. Even history comes under the same category. The idea is its essence and inner nature, but, as it appears, everything is under contingency and in the field of voluntary action. These sciences are positive also in failing to recognize the finite nature of what they predicate, and to point out how these categories and their whole sphere pass into a higher. They assume their statements to possess an authority beyond appeal. Here the fault lies in the finitude of the form, as in the previous instance it lay in the matter. In close sequel to this, sciences are positive in consequence of the inadequate grounds on which their conclusions rest, based as these are on detached and casual inference, upon feeling, faith, and authority, and, generally speaking, upon the deliverances of inward and outward perception. Under this head we must also class the philosophy which proposes to build upon anthropology, facts of consciousness, inward sense, or outward experience. It may hap. 124. Hegel's logic. Penn, however, that empirical is an epithet applicable only to the form of scientific exposition, while intuitive sagacity has arranged what are mere phenomena, according to the essential sequence of the notion. In such a case the contrasts between the varied and numerous phenomena brought together serve to eliminate the external and accidental circumstances of their conditions, and the universal thus comes clearly into view. Guided by such an intuition, experimental physics will present the rational science of nature, as history will present the science of human affairs and ac tions, in an external picture, which mirrors the philosophic notion. Section 1. 7. It may seem as if philosophy, in order to start on its course, had, like the rest of the sciences, to begin with a subjective presupposition. The sciences postulate their respective objects, such as space, number, or whatever it be, and it might be supposed that philosophy had also to postulate the existence of thought. But the two cases are not exactly parallel. It is by the free act of thought that it occupies a point of view, in which it is for its own self, and thus gives itself an object of its own production. Nor is this all. The very point of view, which originally is taken on its own evidence only, must in the course of the science be converted to a result, the ultimate result in which philosophy returns into itself and reaches the point with which it began. In this manner philosophy exhibits the appearance of a circle which closes with itself, and has no beginning in the same way as the other sciences have. To speak of a beginning of philosophy has a meaning only in relation to a person who proposes to commence the study, and not in relation to the science as science. The same thing may be thus expressed. The notion of science, the notion therefore with which we start, which, for the very reason that it is initial, implies a separation between the thought which is our object, and the subject philosophizing which is, as it were, external to the former, must be grasped and comprehended by the science itself. This is in short, the one single aim, action, and goal of philosophy, to arrive at the notion of its notion, and thus secure its return and its satisfaction. Section 1. 8 is the whole science, and only the whole, can exhibit what the idea or system of reason is. It is impossible to give in a preliminary way a general impression of a philosophy. Nor can a division of philosophy into its parts be intelligible, except in connection with the system. A preliminary. Introduction. 125. Division, like the limited conception from which it comes, can only be an anticipation. Here however it is premised that the idea turns out to be the thought which is completely identical with itself, and not identical simply in the abstract, but also in its action of setting itself over against itself, so as to gain a being of its own, and yet of being in full possession of itself while it is in this other. Thus philosophy is subdivided into three parts. Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself. 2. The philosophy of nature, the science of the idea in its otherness. 3. The philosophy of mind, the science of the idea come back to itself out of that otherness. As observed in section 15, the differences between the several philosophical sciences are only aspects or specializations of the one idea or system of reason, which alone is alike exhibited in these different media. In nature nothing else would have to be discerned, except the idea, but the idea has here divested itself of its proper being. In mind, again, the idea has asserted a being of its own, and is on the way to become absolute. Every such form in which the idea is expressed is at the same time a passing or fleeting stage, and hence each of these subdivisions has not only to know its contents as an object which has being for the time, but also in the same act to expound how these contents pass into their higher circle. To represent the relation between them as a division, therefore, leads to misconception, for it co-ordinates the several parts or sciences one beside another, as if they had no innate development, but were, like so many species, really and radically distinct. 2. Preliminary notion. Logic derived from a survey of the whole system. Section 19 Logic is the science of the pure idea. Pure, that is, because the idea is in the abstract medium of thought. This definition, and the others which occur in these introductory outlines, are derived from a survey of the whole system, to which accordingly they are subsequent. The same remark applies to all prefatory notions whatever about philosophy. Logic might have been defined as the science of thought, and of its laws and characteristic forms. But thought, as thought, constitutes only the general medium, or qualifying circumstance, which renders the idea distinctively logical. If we identify the idea with thought, thought must not be taken in the sense of a method or form, but in the sense of the self-developing totality of its laws and peculiar terms. These laws are the work of thought itself, and not a fact which it finds and must submit to. From different points of view, logic is either the hardest or the easiest of the sciences. Logic is hard, because it has to deal not with perceptions, nor, like geometry, with abstract representations of the senses, but with the pure abstractions, and because it demands a force and facility of withdrawing into pure thought, of keeping firm hold on it, and of moving in such an element. Logic is easy, because its facts are nothing but our own thought in its familiar forms or terms, and these are the acme of simplicity, the ABC of everything else. They are also what we are best acquainted with, such as is and is not, quality and magnitude, being potential and being actual, one, many, and so on. But such an acquaintance only adds to the difficulties of the study, for while, on the one hand, we naturally think it is not worth our trouble to occupy ourselves any longer with things so familiar, on the other hand, the problem is to become acquainted with them in a new way, quite opposite to that in which we know them already. The utility of logic is a matter which concerns its bearings upon the student, and the training it may give for other purposes. This logical training consists in the exercise and thinking which the student has to go. Preliminary notion. 127. Through this science is the thinking of thinking, and in the fact that he stores his head with thoughts, in their native unalloyed character. It is true that logic, being the absolute form of truth, and another name for the very truth itself, is something more than merely useful. Yet if what is noblest, most liberal, and most independent is also most useful, logic has some claim to the latter character. Its utility must then be estimated at another rate than exercise and thought for the sake of the exercise. Section 19N. 1. The first question is, what is the object of our science? The simplest and most intelligible answer to this question is that truth is the object of logic. Truth is a noble word, and the thing is nobler still. So long as man is sound at heart and in spirit, the search for truth must awake all the enthusiasm of his nature. But immediately there steps in the objection, are we able to know truth? There seems to be a disproportion between finite beings like ourselves and the truth which is absolute, and doubts suggest themselves whether there is any bridge between the finite and the infinite. God is truth. How shall we know him? Such an undertaking appears to stand in contradiction with the graces of lowliness and humility. Others who ask whether we can know the truth have a different purpose. They want to justify themselves in living uncontented with their petty, finite aims. And humility of this stamp is a poor thing. But the time is past when people asked, how shall I, a poor worm of the dust, be able to know the truth? And in its stead we find vanity and conceit. People claim, without any trouble on their part, to breathe the very atmosphere of truth. The young have been flattered into the belief that they possess a natural birthright of moral and religious truth. And in the same strain, those of riper years are declared to be sunk, petrified, ossified in falsehood. Youth, say these teachers, sees the bright light of dawn, but the older generation lies in the slough and mire of the common day. They admit that the special sciences are something that certainly ought to be cultivated, but merely as the means to satisfy the needs of outer life. In all this it is not humility which holds back from the knowledge and study of the truth, but a conviction that we are already in full possession of it. And no doubt the young carry with them the hopes of their elder compeers, on them rests the advance of the world and science. But these hopes are set upon the young, only on the condition that, instead of remaining as they are, they undertake the stern labor of mind. 128. Hegel's logic. This modesty and truth-seeking has still another phase, and that is the genteel indifference to truth, as we see it in Pilate's conversation with Christ. Pilate asked, "What is truth?" with the air of a man who had settled accounts with everything long ago, and concluded that nothing particularly matters. He meant much the same as Solomon when he says, "All is vanity." When it comes to this, nothing is left but self-conceit. The knowledge of the truth meets an additional obstacle in timidity. A slothful mind finds it natural to say, "Don't let it be supposed that we mean to be in earnest with our philosophy. We shall be glad inter alia to study logic, but logic must be sure to leave us as we were before." People have a feeling that, if thinking passes the ordinary range of our ideas and impressions, it cannot but be on the evil road. They seem to be trusting themselves to a sea on which they will be tossed to and fro by the waves of thought, till at length they again reach the sandbank of this temporal scene, as utterly poor as when they left it. What comes of such a view, we see in the world. It is possible within these limits to gain varied information and many accomplishments, to become a master of official routine, and to be trained for special purposes. But it is quite another thing to educate the spirit for the higher life and to devote our energies to its service. In our own day it may be hoped a longing for something better has sprung up among the young, so that they will not be contented with the mere straw of outer knowledge. 2. It is universally agreed that thought is the object of logic. But of thought our estimate may be very mean, or it may be very high. On one hand, people say, it is only a thought. In their view thought is subjective, arbitrary and accidental, distinguished from the thing itself, from the true and the real. On the other hand, a very high estimate may be formed of thought. When thought alone is held adequate to attain the highest of all things, the nature of God, of which the senses can tell us nothing. God is a spirit, it is said, and must be worshipped in spirit and in truth.